Hear all these stories anywhere you listen to podcasts on the Let's Read podcast. I'd been working as a wilderness guide out near Mount Shasta for about 3 months when I first met Noah. I moved to California from Minnesota, so I didn't really know anyone outside of my coworkers. And since the town is mostly a lot of tourists, I'd have to drive down to Redding to find people that weren't just working or passing through. And that's how I met Noah and her friends while hanging out and watching the Vikings at a bar. She was nice and really pretty too, with those deep brown eyes that she said came from the Italian side of her family. We swapped phone numbers, went for some coffee and drinks a few times, and then when things started getting a little more serious, coffee and drinks turned into longer and less public meetings. Noah thought it was cool that I got to work with nature, but it never occurred to me to turn a trail hike into a date. She lived down in Redding, and I preferred heading down there since she had a nicer apartment and a cat. And there was also way more to do down there, so in the end, it was Noah who asked me if she could drive up to Shasta sometime to check out the trails that I worked. No, I thought it sounded like a great idea, and like I said, I was kind of kicking myself for not thinking of it sooner. She was super into nature, and so I could impress her with all of my accumulated knowledge, and it'd be cute to spend some time out there alone instead of surrounded by other people down in the city. She drove up to Shasta in the morning, and then after spending some time putting a little picnic together, we drove out to the trailhead near the upper sand flats and then hiked into the woods from there. The first thing I told her about, because the ladies always love this one, is how old-timey prospectors used to keep ringtails as pets. A ringtail is a small rodent, kind of like a cross between a fox and a squirrel. They're very cute, and I strongly recommend that you Google them to see just how cute they are. But the miners didn't keep them around because they were cute. Oh no. They called them miners' cats because they were great at scaring off the rats that tried making their homes among the camp. I talked about how wolves had been reintroduced into the area and how it stabilized the deer population. Then I remember mentioning the prairie falcons and how they reached speeds of 200 miles per hour when they're dive-bombing prey. But one of my favorite little factoids, and one Noah loved too, was a behavior in black-tailed deer that we call flagging. And just like their name suggests, black-tailed deer have black tails, but only on the tops and sides. The undersides of the tails is the same color as their butts, a sort of off-white, and when they detect a potential threat in the area, their tails shoot up to show the white and then not the black side. And it's kind of like a collective traffic light. Something that says ready, steady before the go when the threat proves significant, and it's just one of many examples of how animals have developed methods of wordless communication. Now we walked for a few miles, with me dropping the aforementioned facts here and there, and then when we stopped for our picnic, I told Noah how Mount Shasta has its share of carnivorous plants, like the California pitcher. I also told her how growers have been trying to introduce the matsutake mushroom to the region, which is highly prized in Japanese cuisine. The only thing is, it can take up to a century for the fungus to form the symbiotic relationships with the pine trees that allow them to mature before fruiting. And that means that people trying to introduce will probably never even live to see the fruits of their labors. They're doing it entirely for the next generation, and we agree that there was something very beautiful about that. And I remember at one point, Noah, who was having a great time, said something along the lines of, "Oh man, my dad would love this. We should totally bring him up here sometime." Now, I went quiet for what felt like the first time on the whole hike because she kind of casually let slip that I was the bring them home to dad type. Now, I was really into her, and so it felt amazing that she saw me that way. And then after pivoting towards family, we spent a little while talking about more personal stuff. Up until that point, it was probably the best date I'd ever been on, talking about something that I was passionate about, but impressing someone that I cared about all the while. But I had no idea at all how wrong things were about to go. And as the sun reached its peak and the day got to its hottest few hours, we were sort of taking on water like nobody's business. And so inevitably it came time for a little bathroom break. We agreed to walk off the trail in different directions, me taking on some trees on the left while she walked up this very steep slope to the right where it leveled off for a little more privacy from the trail. I figured that we'd be separated for a matter of minutes, and I also figured that I'd be done much quicker for reason of mail logistics, so I wasn't alarmed or anything when I got back to the trail and Noah wasn't there. But as the minutes ticked by and Noah still hadn't reappeared, I started to get a little worried. I took a few steps up the slope, not all the way as to impede her privacy, and then I called out her name and asked if she was all good. At the time, I thought I expected to hear her say something back, but I think looking back on it, it was more like hoped, because I remember that feeling of hope turning into this very rising panic when Noah didn't reply. It was dead silent from the top of that rise there, and it worried me so much that I walked to the top to see where Noah was. But when I looked, she was nowhere to be seen. Now, I think I hesitated for a moment looking at all the trees and bushes in front of me because it seemed totally logical that she'd walked off into the trees and out of sight to get her privacy. And it also didn't seem out of the question that she just didn't want to yell back at me because she was in the midst of peeing. I know that might sound dumb, but I was honestly just trying to rationalize the situation and not totally catastrophize it. But then looking back, I was a fool not to trust my instinct and go looking for her. Because only seconds after calling out Noah's name a second time, I heard her scream. Now, without thinking, I started running in the direction of that scream before suddenly stopping myself. I dropped my backpack from my shoulders and was just totally frantic as I tore it open and went for the little pouch meant for my .45. I hadn't told Noah that I brought a gun with me. She was really anti-gun, so I didn't want to freak her out by announcing that I was carrying. But I also wasn't about to head out into the trail without a means of actually protecting us, so given the circumstances, you can bet that I was glad that I brought it. And I guess I should also make it clear how just from the sound of Noah's scream, I knew that she hadn't just sprained her ankle. It wasn't a scream of pain. It was a scream of terror, and I wasn't about to square up whatever scared her so badly without protection. I found the gun, and then went running off into the trees while calling out Noah's name. Now, I called out maybe 2 or 3 more times as I was running, but again, got nothing in reply, so I kept on moving through the trees with my head on a swivel, until suddenly, I saw her. Noah was being dragged along the forest floor by her hair, and the person dragging her looked normal. Now, remember this sort of split second thinking, total confusion almost as I locked eyes with the guy dragging her. I guess in my head, this guy should have looked like a monster. I mean, quite literally some big lumbering beast that was hairy and teethy and clawy, you know? But he didn't look like that at all because, like I said, he just sort of looked normal. He had a blue t-shirt on, khaki shorts, and then tan hiking boots with colorful socks sticking out the tops. He looked like your average hiker, completely unremarkable aside from the fact that he was dragging my date across the ground by the hair. We locked eyes, and in that split second, I could see how scared he was. All I remember thinking was, good, you should be scared. And then I aimed that gun at him and screamed at him to let her go. The guy looked terrified, but he didn't let go of Noah's hair. In fact, after maybe only a split second of him being still, he kept on pulling her like twice as hard. He was obviously trying to get away, but there was no way that he was about to outrun me while trying to drag a human body. The smart thing to do would have been to just let go of her hair and run, but he didn't. He was so fixated on her that he made this laughable, futile attempt to cart her away and escape. I mean, it might actually have been funny if he wasn't dragging Noah by her hair, but he was, so it was this weird combination of insane and horrifying to me. And with the gun still aimed at him, I yelled at him to let Noah go or I'd shoot. The guy stopped again and looked at me with that sort of same scared look in his eyes. And when he didn't let her go, I remember thinking, okay, it's happening. But then as I began to line my sights up on his chest and went to squeeze the trigger, I found that I couldn't actually do it. I felt the cold metal of that trigger on my finger, but right as I was about to pull it, it was like I heard this voice in my head yelling, don't do it. You'll hit Noah. And I knew that was possible, but given the relative position of her body to where this guy was standing, it'd have to either be the worst or the unluckiest shot in the history of firearms. I wasn't a bad shot either, like I knew I could have dropped the guy at those kinds of ranges, but like I said, when it came to pulling the trigger, I locked up in a way I never anticipated. And then when I locked up, the fear and doubt started to completely overwhelm me. I was frozen to the spot, not being able to shoot but not daring to lower my gun either, but the worst thing was, the guy could tell. He saw a fear bigger than his own reflected in my eyes, and when he did, I think it calmed him. He didn't smile or laugh or anything sinister like that. He just sort of turned his head to make sure that the way was clear, and then just kept on dragging this now semi-conscious but still weak Noah through the trees. But that spurred me into action. I still couldn't bring myself to take a shot right at him. I was just scared to, I guess. But what I could bring myself to do was warn him. Now, I can already hear all the ultimate badasses in the comments saying, "Oh man, such a pussy, couldn't bring himself to shoot a man to protect his girl." Well, while you might be the super soldier who inspired John Wick, I'm not him. And while you might be so skilled with a pistol that you give yourself prostate exams with them, and I'm sure you do, that's not me. And so the only shot that I knew would be 100% safe was the kind of warning shot above the guy's head, the kind that had absolutely zero chance of hitting either of them, and so that's what I did. I aimed higher and fired a warning shot that flew well above his head, but it was enough to make him jump and turn back to me with this look of absolute terror in his face. I yelled the only thing that came to mind, which was how if he didn't let her go, the next bullet was going to find him. It was the only remotely badass thing I did during that whole encounter, and I guess it only worked because I needed it to, but it was effective. The guy then let go of Noah's hair, then turned and ran off through the trees. I immediately followed, rushing forward to where Noah was lying. At this point, she was half awake, coming to after having been hit pretty hard in the jaw with something. There was blood coming out of her mouth, her eyes looked like they were struggling to focus, and I had to support her after helping her to her feet. I put her back down again once we got to the trail, and then as she realized where she was and remembered what had happened, she just started crying. Since the cell signal was so shoddy on account of being relatively low altitude, I did the only thing I could do, which was try and console her. She kept going back and forth between apologizing and thanking me, and while I'm not sure what the apologies were for, she certainly didn't have to thank me. I told her it was okay, that the man was gone and he didn't seem to be armed, but that we needed to get her out of there to get her jaw checked at the hospital. We could move at whatever pace she wanted because I had my gun to protect us, but the longer we stayed, the more chance that he'd try and come back to find us. And maybe that time, he'd have something to fire back. We were up and moving again seconds later at a mixed pace of jogging and walking fast. I think all the heavy breathing brought Noah a kind of calm because before long, she was able to tell me exactly what had happened after we went off to pee. And even all these years later, thinking about it scares the hell out of me. So Noah said that she'd walked off into the trees at the top of the slope and then put enough of them between me and her to ensure that no one peeking up from the trail could get a look at her. She drops her shorts, does her thing, but then as she's buttoning them up again, she hears something moving kind of close to her. She stayed put and stayed quiet, and then when she heard me calling out her name, she was too scared to respond. She said it felt like the thing close to her was hunting her, and calling back to it would have allowed it to find her. But then seconds later, she hears a sort of thud, thud, thud of fast footsteps behind her, and then when she turns to look, bam. The first hit didn't knock her out, and that's when she screamed. The second one knocked her unconscious briefly, but by that time, help was on the way. I was worried that she might have a fractured jaw, maybe some kind of damage to her teeth, but luckily the only wounds were to the inside of Noah's cheek. She had some pretty nasty bruising on her face, and it took a while for the inside of her mouth to heal, but I'd say that she escaped some pretty nasty injuries. And if that guy had gotten her to wherever he wanted her, I'd say that she might have even escaped a fate worse than death, too. We obviously filed a police report at the Shasta Police Department that very same day, right after Noah was discharged from the hospital. It was stressful for her, really stressful, having to kind of relive those events so soon, but we agreed it was better to get it on paper while it was fresh in our mind. We thought it paid off too when the cops told us they'd arrested a guy. But after we drove back to the department and Noah checked out the guy's booking photo, we both agreed it wasn't him. The guy in the photo had a bunch of violent convictions, many of which involved female victims, but as much as we wanted it to be, it wasn't the same guy that attacked Noah. It affected her for a while after. Like she said she had nightmares about seeing the guy's face suddenly in places that she didn't expect it to be. I really felt for her, and I made myself available in every capacity I could. And then, as messed up as it sounds, it was that horrible event that brought us way closer together and put us on the road to where we are today. Me and Noah are still together, coming up on 7 years now, and this year I'm finally going to do the right thing and ask her to marry me. And maybe if you read this on your podcast, it'll be how she finds out what I'm planning. But if not, well, I'm sure I'll think of a way to ask the love of my life to be my lawful wedded wife. And so I can spend the rest of my life protecting her, the same way I did near Mount Shasta that day. More than 3 decades ago, back when I was a much younger man, I helped a mate of mine move down to Glasgow from our home city of Newcastle. He'd managed to get a job as a football scout for Glasgow Rangers, which was basically his dream career. And so while me and all of our mates were sad to see the back of him, we were all really proud of him too. Now, we drove up early in the morning, and then once everything was unloaded, we had some pub grub and a few lagers, shandies from me, and then I started on the drive back to Newcastle. I'd left it quite late to drive back, so it was about midnight by the time I started to see signs for the English borders. The roads were quiet, with only the occasional lorry thundering past me, and I remember there being some phone-in thing on the radio, but I wasn't really listening. I was in my old Vauxhall Cavalier, an '82 model that I bought on the cheap about 4 years prior. It normally served me well, and it had been running fine all day, but just after passing a place called Jedburgh, the temperature warning light flicked on. I looked at my dash, watching the needle climbing into the red, and swore under my breath as I eased off the accelerator. Since it normally bought me a few minutes, I cranked the heater up full blast to try and pull some heat out of the engine. But that time, it seems my luck finally ran out because just a minute or so later, there was this loud hiss from under the bonnet before steam started pouring out the seams. Seconds later, I heard this horrible metallic knocking sound coming from under the bonnet, and so I coasted over to the hard shoulder and then came to a stop just in time for the engine to seize up completely. And after that, aside from the ticking of my hazard lights and the sound of hot metal cooling down, it was nothing but silence for a few seconds, until I erupted. I remember shouting, "Are you effing kidding me?" a couple of times, and then, after taking a few deep breaths, I got out of the car and tried to fix it. And I tried it for half an hour, and in that time, a grand total of 2 cars passed me, but even with me waving at them as they passed, neither of them stopped. I didn't just stand there like some plonker for the whole 30 minutes, mind you. I popped my bonnet not long after getting out, but when I did, a load of steam and the smell of burnt coolant came wafting up into my face. And after waving away some of the steam, I spotted a crack in the top radiator hose and then noticed how loads of antifreeze was dripping onto the road and forming a big green puddle. I didn't have a spare hose, and neither did I have enough water to top it up properly, and even if I had, the engine had overheated so badly that I didn't trust it not to seize up again. Basically, I wasn't going anywhere in my old Vauxhall, and since there were no mobile phones back then, at least none for the likes of me, I had no choice but to walk if I wanted to get myself some help. Now, I reckon the nearest emergency phone would have been about a mile down the road, maybe more, and so I locked my car, left my hazards flashing, and then started walking along the dark grass verge with a torch in my hand. Now, I thought I'd be on the move for quite a while, but then no sooner had I started walking, I came to a dirt track previously concealed by a long hedgerow, which led to what looked like a big 3-story farmer's house. Now, I was so happy that I was literally punching the air because despite the fact that there were no lights switched on the ground floor, there was what looked to be candlelight in both the front-facing upstairs rooms. I felt bad for calling so late, but since the alternative of walking along the motorway was a much more dangerous one, I reckoned that I didn't have much choice. It was a particularly dark night, small moon and cloud cover, so it was only once I got closer to the house that I saw how run down it was. The ground floor windows were either cracked or newspapered over, and there were cracks in the wood too, along with a lot of peeling paint. And as you can imagine, I started to get really bad vibes from the place. But I try not to judge books by their cover too much because you tend to be rewarded more times than you're burned for it. And so with that in mind, and granted very foolishly, I decided to knock on the door. I didn't knock too loud or aggressively. I didn't want to frighten anyone. But when my first knock got no answer, I knocked a little bit louder. Again, there was complete silence. No footsteps behind the door, no talking inside, nothing. But then after taking a step back and looking up at the top windows, I saw someone peeking out at me from behind a dirty-looking curtain. And I can't lie, it did scare me a bit seeing a pair of eyes staring back at me through the dim light. But as soon as I reacted, the eyes disappeared and I began to hear voices inside the house. Now it sounded like a fair number of people, maybe half a dozen, and they were whispering like they were talking among themselves. I heard a little voice in my head saying, "They're awake, knock again." But before I could even dismiss it, I heard the sound of someone laughing inside the house. Not loudly though, more like a muted sort of wheeze as they tried to keep their voice low. The bad vibes that I was getting ramped up to 11, so instead of risking a confrontation with whoever was either living or more likely squatting there, I decided to make a move. I turned around and walked back up the dirt path as fast as I could, looking over my shoulder every so often to make sure that no one was following me. Now, I was quite certain whoever was inside was watching me from those windows, but as long as they didn't follow me, then I didn't mind what they did. I'd almost gotten to the end of the path to where those 2 wooden gate posts held no gate when I started smelling something strong on the breeze, something that smelled like burning. And then when I turned the corner and could see out onto the road again, I felt this almost involuntary scream jump out of my mouth as I realized what the smell was. It was my car. My car was on fire. Now, I suppose I acted on complete instinct in running over to it because there was absolutely bugger all I could do about putting out that fire. All I could do was just stand there, effing and blinding and looking around for whoever might have done it. But as you can probably guess, there was no one, and the whole area looked deserted. And I knew for a fact that it wasn't. When I realized just how much of a bad situation I truly was in, I started jogging along the road until I got back on the motorway. Now, it was only a 4-lane carriageway, so I could walk along the verge without being in too much danger, but no matter how much danger passing cars posed to me, it still seemed safer than hanging around my burning car in that creepy house. Now, I think probably about a half an hour must have passed with only the odd car going past me, and in that time, I didn't try to get anyone's attention just in case it was the people from the home. I mean, the joke was on them in a sense because that poor cavalier was definitely on her way out, but on the off chance they wanted to do more than just burn my car, I had to be very careful about who I revealed myself to. Now, I was bloody nervous for that first half an hour, but after that, I started to calm down a wee bit. I hadn't seen any cars or anything parked outside the house, and if they really did want to chase me down for whatever reason, I reckoned that I'd have encountered them already. So once I'd calmed down a bit, and after maybe 2 or 3 more cars passed me with me sticking to the trees on the verge, I made my way to the edge of the road and then stuck my thumb out at what looked like a Land Rover of some kind coming my way. Now, it slowed down as the driver saw me, but then instead of switching on the light above the wheel, someone in the passenger seat started shining a torch in my face after lowering their window. And right away, I knew that wasn't promising behavior when I realized whoever was in the car didn't want to be seen, and I turned and started walking away. Now, a second later, I heard a very promising, "Need a lift, pal?" Now, one that was just friendly enough to slow me down and make me think that I might have been overreacting. But then the second I slowed, I turned back to face the car, and the passenger doors opened up and I heard someone shout, "Get him!" Now I remember running right at the trees at the side of the road. Not along the road where the car would have been able to cut me off, but at and then through the trees and bushes at the side of the road. I remember closing my eyes as I felt things scratching against my face, and then when I opened them, I found that I'd come to a fence on the other side. I hopped over it with speed and power that I didn't even know I had in me. I mean, I was hardly some couch potato back then, but I wasn't exactly in perfect shape either. But I swear, I think I vaulted that fence like an Olympic athlete for fear of what might have happened if those men had caught up with me. It's strange thinking back on it as well, because these days, all I do sometimes is sit and wonder why those people chose to go after me like they did. But in the moment, as I was running, it didn't matter a jot to me. All I knew was that those people were out to get me, and all that mattered in the world was getting away from them in that moment. Now, I ran across this big dark field for what felt like ages, running and running until I couldn't anymore. And then when I got to the other side and spotted a road ahead of me, I swear I saw that same Land Rover driving along the road with someone shining a torch out into the field. I had to change my route and head off at an angle to avoid the Land Rover, and along with anyone to my rear who might have followed me. I had to force myself to run when I didn't think that I could run anymore, and even though I was quite a fit young lad and one pumped full of adrenaline, I soon felt like that I was about to cough up a lung and fall over. In the end, I found myself staggering onto a road and then right back onto another dark field because I was too scared to be out in the open with a car full of blokes trying to find me. I kept on going like that until I came across a small town. And then as I was walking its dark and empty streets, looking for anyone who might be able to help, a police car appeared, and an officer asked what I was doing walking the streets alone like that. When I told him what had happened to me, he told me to jump in the car, and then off we went to the police station for a cup of hot tea and a few biscuits, while I went into more detail about what had happened. As soon as I mentioned the house that I'd stopped by and mentioned how there had been people inside, I remember these two officers giving each other a look because they told me that the people inside must have been squatters. I thought that they might have been, partly because of how run down the house was, but the police confirmed that it was derelict and that there shouldn't have been anyone in there. They said that they'd head over and check it out, but they doubted anyone would be there. Squatters are kind of like rats. They're annoying and sometimes they're dangerous, but they're not stupid, and they just move on someplace else and then maybe return when things all blew over. But in all likelihood, they were gone from that house for good. I remember asking the two policemen why. As in, why had they burned my car before trying to hunt me down like that? And the first words out of the policemen's mouths were, "Well, what did you see?" He was convinced that I'd seen them doing something that they shouldn't have been doing, and after spotting my car, which they assumed was still functional, they tried to make sure that I couldn't get away before chasing me down. But that was the thing. I hadn't seen anything, and once I'd established that, all we could think of was that those squatters just wanted to scare me off. One of the policemen said that since they didn't know who I was, they might have assumed that I was some kind of bailiff or law enforcement agent. And at first, they might have been worried that I was a policeman. But then when they realized that I wasn't, they must have reckoned that I was fair game for a kicking. And if only to make sure that I was too scared to return. And with nothing else to say, I gave the police the phone number for my flat in Newcastle. And then, since I literally lost everything but my wallet, one of them was kind enough to give me a lift to a nearby train station. It was long past dawn by then, so the trains were running, and I didn't have to wait long before I was on my way back to Newcastle. They phoned a few days later saying that that house was empty, and there wasn't much in the way of evidence tying anyone to the arson. They promised to keep their ears to the ground and would let me know immediately if there was any progress, but till then, they advised me to be patient because things like that took time. Sadly, that was the last I heard from the police, marking the end of my first encounter with squatters, and hopefully my last too. I had no idea that those people could be so violent. I mean, call me naive, but the squatters I was familiar with were the hippies who took over empty houses in London in the 60s. I thought that they'd be more into peace protests and drum circles than chasing down strangers. But I suppose times had changed then, and people change with them. I grew up in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, but I drifted out west in my teens, ended up getting hooked on heroin, and then spent a little time in federal prison for something I'm not too proud of. Probably goes without saying, but that was rock bottom for me. I made it through without taking any kind of beating, but when I got out, I knew I had to get myself together. For the first time in my life, I had to think about what I wanted to do with myself. I knew I liked being outside, even more so after my stretch in prison, but I knew the chances of me becoming a park or forest ranger as a felon were slim to none. I knew I could try out to be one of those wilderness firefighters because they allow felons to apply if their convictions weren't for violent crimes. But then after stopping at a bar for a couple of beers one Thursday night, I ended up talking to a guy whose cousin operated a tour company out in the Pasayten wilderness. I told him my story over those couple of beers, all the honest-to-God's truth, too, no bullcrap. And when I was done, he asked if I was interested in being a tour guide. And then since it involved walking the trails all day, sometimes even camping out overnight, I only had 2 words for him: hell and yes. I got a call the next day from my future boss asking if I was okay interning for a couple of months so I could prove that I was on the level. He'd give me a place to stay, make sure I was fed, watered, and washed, but while he didn't mind taking a chance on me, he didn't want to pay for the privilege. I didn't tell him this, but at the time, I think I'd have happily worked for a whole year for free if it meant having my dream job at the end of it. So I accepted his offer, and then made my way to a small town up in the hills called Barron. I honestly had no idea what to expect, but when I arrived, I found the place was way more comfortable than I ever expected. There were 4 other guides staying up there, not including the boss who lived down in Winthrop, and they each shared a cabin that had full amenities. There were 3 of them, so I got one all to myself for a while. I knew it was only because the other guides didn't trust me, and probably because the boss had warned them that I was an ex-con, but they were nice enough, so I didn't mind having to earn their trust and respect over time. I really didn't know what to expect from the clientele either, but they proved to be a real mixed bag. You'd get your tourists and your adventure vacation types, who you're only there to make sure that they didn't get lost or wander anywhere they shouldn't. And then there were the corporate team builders or the bachelor parties who were more party than peace. And I fell into the rhythm of that place pretty quickly and started making friends pretty quickly too once people saw how serious I was about it. And then once my trial period was up and I was a fully trained and fully paid up member of the guiding team, I was able to head out with parties all on my own and sometimes for a night or 2 of camping. And that's how I ended up meeting a family of 4 headed up by an older lady named Patty. Patty and her husband must have been in their 60s, maybe early 70s, and they had their 2 grown-up kids with them. They decided to spend a little time in the great outdoors together on account of raising their 2 grown-up kids on concrete, and right away, I could tell that they were going to be great guests. They were just about as wholesome a family unit as it was possible to get, at least in my opinion anyway. They clearly loved each other very much, but they were real funny too, and the way they went at it with each other had me laughing along with them. They were interesting folks too and had some amazing stories to share, so it was one of those parties that was such a pleasure to guide that if I was a millionaire, I would have happily guided them for free. And so we hiked all day, stopped for breaks here and there, until we reached our campsite for the night. I got us a fire going with the help of Patty's grown-up son, then she insisted on doing all the campfire cooking so I could relax and take a load off. We had 2 tents with us, one for the parents, one for the kids, and a reminder that they are grown-up people, and then my small one-man pup tent. We got them all set up, went over a few emergency procedures in case anything happened in the night, and then each went to our sleeping bags for the evening. But what I didn't know, what I could never have known, was just how wrong things were going to go for us during the next day's hike. I remember waking up to the sound of voices and being blinded by flashlights when I looked out of my tent. There, standing outside their tents in what amounted to their nighttime wear, were Patty's husband, son, and daughter, but there was no Patty anywhere to be seen. The three of them were whispering at first, but when they heard me asking what was going on, they told me that Patty was missing. Her husband said that he woke up to noises beside him in the tent, but figured his wife was just rolling over in her sleep or something. And then when he asked if she was okay and he didn't hear any reply, he realized that not only was the tent's front flap unzipped, but his wife was nowhere to be seen. Patty's husband then takes a walk around outside for her just to make sure that she really is off taking a leak somewhere. And then when a couple of minutes went by and she hadn't returned, he woke up his kids. And that's when they realized that Patty hadn't even put her shoes on. We briefly discussed the procedure for someone going missing, and so after a quick reminder, we each walked off in a different compass direction with our flashlights and then started yelling out Patty's name. We kept each other's flashlights in view and we didn't go too far, but we kept on yelling her name as loud as we could, and when we didn't get any response, we kept on pushing outwards a little more until we were maybe 100 meters apart on all sides. We yelled and kept on yelling, but still didn't hear a thing from Patty in response. And since I didn't want anyone wandering off and getting lost, I called out for everyone to return to camp. I planned on contacting the local rangers and enlisting their help while I got the family back to headquarters, but Patty's son didn't like that idea at all. A small argument broke out between myself and the son, who insisted that we stay and keep on looking. Now, she was an older lady, so she couldn't have gotten far, I think, and while I agreed, we had certain protocols to follow in the event of someone going missing like that, and those protocols were based on keeping everyone else in a group safe. Yet Patty's husband agreed with their son and insisted that they stay at the camp and keep calling out her name in case she got lost, and so she could find her way back to the camp. I had to work with them. I had to at least give them some hope in that respect. And honestly, because that's the exact same thing I hoped someone might do for me if that was my mom out there lost in the dark forest. And so, while I started to pack up our stuff, I told Patty's son that I wouldn't stop him if he wanted to take one last look around the perimeter. And as you can imagine, he was grateful for my cooperation, but I also get the feeling that he'd have punched me right in the face if I had insisted on leaving. And so off he went, him and his dad, while I tried my best to keep Patty's daughter calm as I packed away my gear and got a start on the group stuff too. I didn't think they'd find anything. I mean, I hope they did, but the wilderness makes you a cynic over time on account of how cruel nature can truly be. And so imagine how surprised and relieved I was when, maybe 10 minutes after they left, I heard the sound of the son's voice coming through the trees as he yelled, "We got her." Patty's daughter burst into tears when she saw her dad and brother approaching with their mom in tow, and I'm not ashamed to say that I wasn't far from tears myself by that point. I'd never had to deal with anything like that before, so to have it over and done with so quickly was an incredible relief. Patty seemed really shaken as we checked her over for injuries, and while her son kept asking what happened, where did you go, she didn't seem to have an answer for them. When she did talk, she just kept saying, "I don't know. I can't remember. I think I got lost." And that all kind of made sense to me once I realized that she'd walked off without a flashlight, because it gets so oppressively dark at night out in the wilderness that it can get really disorienting and frightening very quickly. And I remember telling everyone not to worry, that Patty would probably be more articulate once she'd gotten some sleep and some food, and we were all pretty exhausted by that point. But even after a few hours of sleep and some protein bars and coffee for breakfast, things continued to get worse. To stay on schedule, we could only get a couple of more hours of sleep before we had to wake up, pack up, and make our way back to HQ. And that meant that we were all kind of tired and cranky waking up at 6:30 a.m., but still super relieved that we'd found Patty and avoided any major disasters. I made that coffee, handed out those bars, and while I did, I noticed that Patty was still unusually quiet, especially in comparison to what a chatty Patty she was the day before. I didn't press her too much on it. I just asked if she was feeling okay and was good to walk back to base, and she said sure after apologizing for scaring us. She seemed like her usual self, or at least the usual self that I'd come to know in those 24 hours, but there was something, I don't know, missing. Like she was still a little confused or spooked regarding what had happened that night. And like I said, I didn't press her on it, as I figured that she was probably dealing with a lot of mixed emotions at that point. But as we got back to the trail and started heading back to HQ, Patty's behavior took a series of dramatic turns, and very much for the worst. I think we were maybe 20 minutes into the hike, and it was a nice quiet morning too, so you could hear a pin drop whenever the birds weren't tweeting. Now I'm leading the group. The two grown-up kids are behind me while Patty and her husband are at the rear, and I could hear them whispering to each other, not to keep secrets or anything, just to preserve that early morning calm. But then at one point, I hear Patty's husband say something like, "What did you say? In fact, you know what? Don't. We'll talk about this later." Now, he didn't raise his voice or anything, he just sounded irritated, and since it's my general policy not to intervene until tempers start to flare too badly, I didn't even acknowledge what was said. It's not entirely unusual for folks to get a little snippy with each other, especially when they're tired and out of their comfort zones, and generally speaking, the best course of action is to not escalate, i.e. don't get involved. Little tips like that generally smooth themselves out, as no one wants to have a big family or inter-friend argument in front of the trail guide. But not in this case, not at all. It must have only been a couple of minutes later that I heard Patty's husband behind me say something like, "I told you, Patty, this is not the time. We can talk about this later." To which she replied, and these were her exact words, "We'll talk about it, and then we'll go running off into the arms of one of your whores." Now, both her grown-up kids gasped and were like, "Mom? What the hell?" Now, I felt the exact same way, having seen this sweet old lady go from a ray of sunshine the day before to having a mouth like a damned sewer rat the day after. I mean, that probably sounds a little rich coming from someone who curses up a storm every now and then, but my point stands. Something about Patty was way different, and even with all that crap I've been through in my life, I found the change to be very unsettling. She started off on some rant about how her husband wasn't faithful, how he hadn't been so for years, and he thought that she was dumb for not knowing, but she knew. I remember the husband snapping at her and then yelling, "Patty, I told you, this is not the time." And that silenced her, and I turned to tell them all very politely to just keep moving as fast as they could so we could get them back to base on schedule. I remember turning around and walking backwards while I said it, and considering what she just said, I expected Patty to have a face like thunder. Only she didn't. Quite the opposite, actually. She was sort of smiling, ear to ear. And that was the point where I turned to Patty's son and asked him to drop back a little so I could talk with him in private. And then with his sister now at the lead, we dropped back a ways behind his parents and got to talking. Now, he was understandably on edge, but even more so that we talked because I told him strange turns in behavior like that could be caused by some pretty serious head injuries. And he knew that all too well himself, as I think he was some kind of personal injury specialist, but here's the stickler. Patty didn't show any sign whatsoever of having any kind of head injury. We checked her pretty much all over the night before, especially her scalp, because her hair does a real good job of hiding bumps, cuts, and bruises, especially when those cuts aren't bleeding particularly heavy. But like I said, there was nothing, not even so much as a bump on her head. That didn't mean that she'd taken some kind of fall, but regardless, she needed to be taken to a hospital and checked out for anything that we might have missed. He agreed, and then said the first thing that they'd do once we got back to HQ was drive her to the nearest hospital. But as it turned out, we didn't make it back there at all. As we kept on hiking, Patty started getting very snippy and mean again, but this time it was directed at her kids. Now, I couldn't believe my damn ears as some of the stuff that she was saying. Now, it sounded like she was dragging up age-old fights and wrongdoings, but then from the reaction of her kids, she was putting a particularly venomous and untrue spin on things. Such as one point she accused her son of selling pot in college, and he just about exploded, saying something along the lines of, "No, I did not. I got high like one time, Mom. One time. I could be disbarred if people heard you talking about this." Now, she said something really mean to her daughter too, but I'm not sure that I could say what that was without if this ever makes it to a video on YouTube, it might get nuked, you know? And I mean, it's not even worth typing out for you to decide which part needs to be removed because all of it was about as poisonous as you could possibly imagine. I mean, imagine the worst stuff you could ever accuse a woman of, and that's what Patty's mom was accusing her daughter of. It was so bad that the daughter burst into tears as she asked her why she was acting the way she was, and then just kept going on like that until Patty's husband yelled at her to shut the hell up. It all got so bad that I had to step in and ask them to calm down, and I never do that unless things get really, really bad. The daughter was in tears, the son looked next to traumatized, and Patty's husband had turned so red that he looked like a tomato in hiking gear. But Patty, you guessed it, she's just there smiling ear to ear. Like what she'd said and the reactions it had gotten was the most amusing and satisfying thing in the world to her. Now, I was so alarmed by it that I asked her, very nice and polite, if she could just refrain from starting arguments until I'd at least gotten them safely back. Now, most folks don't want to argue in front of their guide, and they tend to treat me as a kind of neutral party too. But on this occasion, that formerly sweet old lady looked me dead in the eyes, told me to shut the F up before she got her husband to knock my teeth out. Well, everything exploded again. The daughter cried, the son comforted her, and the husband started really roaring at Patty, asking what the hell had gotten into her that she'd say something like that. Now he turned to me and said, "I'll do nothing like that, Devin, rest assured." But then turned back to Patty and started screaming at her again. And I had to seriously step in that time and ask everyone to just calm down before things escalated even further. I didn't even know what the escalation might even look like, I just knew that I didn't want to see it. But I don't think I've ever expected things to happen the way they did because after another period of silence, after calming everyone down, I was at the lead when I heard Patty's husband scream my name. I turned around to see her with a rock in her hand, a big one, and from the looks of things, she was trying to smash her husband in the face with it. Everyone jumped up in to stop it, as in me, the son, and the daughter, while Patty's husband looked so shocked that his face turned from that deep red to an almost bright pale white instantly. Her son grabbed her, her daughter pulled the rock out of her hand, and then they actually took her down to the ground as really carefully and gently as they could, which in fairness wasn't all that gentle considering that she was kicking and flailing and even trying to bite them at one point. I told Patty's husband to just keep her where she was, no matter what. Don't let her run off into the woods and get lost again. He was really shaken, but assured me that she wasn't going anywhere, and neither were they. And so after dropping my pack and telling them that I'd return as quickly as possible, I ran off in the direction of headquarters, keeping a steady jogging pace until I arrived back maybe 20 to 25 minutes later. I felt ready to puke up my own lungs by the time I stopped running, and I had to spend maybe a minute catching my breath before I could actually describe the situation that was happening back on the trail. We had an ATV with a Medlight transport trailer attached, which are those gurney things that you see attached to them so injured people can be moved around off-road. And so after a coworker grabbed the keys, I rode back to where Patty and her family were. I was terrified things had gotten even worse in my absence, but while things seemed to have calmed down a little, Patty's condition hadn't improved any. It had actually gotten worse. She was still in the ground when we arrived, but she wasn't being restrained by her kids anymore. Instead, she looked exhausted, and there was a little puddle of puke nearby where she'd been vomiting. All that venom seemed to have left her too, because when I asked her if she was awake, all she'd say was, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I don't know what happened." And that was all perfectly normal sounding, to go up and down like that, I mean. They call them mood swings for a reason, right? And that only further convinced me that Patty was suffering the effects of some kind of head injury that we didn't know about. But then Patty's son took me aside, and with a sort of scared look on his face, he says, "I think she's losing her mind, man." Now, I reassured him that that probably wasn't what was happening, and that people don't just lose their minds like that after getting lost in the woods for a brief period of time. But he still needed to rush her to a hospital once they were able to do so, and with that, he agreed wholeheartedly. But he did say something that frightened me too, and that was how she hadn't responded when he called her Mom. Patty's son described how after asking her something along the lines of, "Mom, are you feeling any better?" she acted like she was ignoring him. And he got kind of mad and then says, Don't just ignore me, Mom." But then she looked at him from where she was laying with this very confused look on her face. And it was like he had to remind her that's who she was to him, his mom, and after that she just kept apologizing and saying she could remember where she was. And even now I find all that very confusing because while that's all still consistent with someone receiving a major head injury, an injury like that would not have been difficult to detect. So the fact that there was no blood in her hair from a gash or a big lump where she'd suffer a nasty impact to make her concussed, it made no sense to us at all. Once I told them what happened, everyone back at headquarters agreed that it was best to contact EMS, and then since we were way out in the sticks and Patty's condition seemed really serious, they ended up sending out an air ambulance. Now, I've never seen a helicopter hover so low before, but I didn't exactly have time to enjoy it either. I was scared for Patty, and I felt so terrible for her husband and 2 kids who, as you can imagine, were in a really bad way by the time the helicopter showed up. All I could do was tell them that I'd be praying for them and that our doors were always open to them, and then after they drove off, that was the end of it. We didn't hear anything more about Patty or what happened to her that night on the trail, but we didn't forget it, especially not me. Time went by, but I found myself just thinking about Patty on a daily basis and without fail. Anytime I was out in the trails, especially when the day got close to being done, I'd picture her waking up, climbing out of her tent and just wandering off in the darkness in her bare feet. We could understand her putting her boots on and walking off to go urinate somewhere, but walking off without them seemed to suggest that she was either really scared of something or just wanted to run, or she was in some kind of trance. Now, they call it a fugue state in psychology. You may have heard of it, and me and the other guides have talked about it at length. It's rare as hell, but every so often, someone's mind stays asleep while their bodies just keep moving, like there's someone or something else at the wheel, like sleepwalking. And that's kind of what we think happened to Patty. That maybe she fell and bashed her head, and that's what brought her out of it. But all we had were guesses and theories, and none of us wanted to contact Patty's family out of respect for their privacy. I hoped that maybe they'd call one day and let us know how she was. But why would they? I was just the trail guide, and by the looks of things, they had way bigger fish to fry than checking in with me. I just wish I knew what happened to that poor lady, because sometimes thinking about that just scares the hell out of me. My name's Hank. I'm a proud Texan, and I work as a bus driver taking folks all over this great state of ours. Most of those journeys take place during the day, but sometimes I like to earn a little extra pay by taking the overnight journeys, or what you might call the red eyes. I fire up that big old rig around dusk, load her up with the sleepy travelers heading either home or away, and then take off along those long, lonely highways that stretch from Houston to El Paso and every place in between. I wouldn't call it a difficult job, but as long as you can keep the wheels turning through the witching hours and dodge all those back road deer, you can almost guarantee everybody gets where they're going safe and sound by sunup. And it's not often the bus causes you problems, because if you keep her clean and well-oiled, and she'll keep you moving and happy. It's the people that complicate things, though. Not every kind of person, but a certain kind, and all the worst rides have been down to that certain kind of person. Including this one, which was probably the worst I have ever experienced. Driving the bus across Texas at night with nothing but country songs and the stars to keep me company, it sometimes makes me feel like a night watchman, one charged with guarding the whole damn state. Now, I meet all kinds of interesting people on that open road under the big Texas sky, and then watching the sun rise over the prairies after a long shift, it's pure gold, but the cons hit hard too. Your sleep schedule gets all turned around, so whenever you're working nights, you miss out double on family dinners and weekends with the kids. The fatigue creeps up on you too, and dealing with rowdy passengers or breakdowns in the middle of nowhere is no picnic. But every so often, you get a special kind of rowdy. The kind that's not just drunk and loud or complaining about fellow passengers' body odor. The kind that's dangerous. Real dangerous. Back during the fall of 2007, I was on a run from Dallas to Austin, driving through the pitch black with nothing but tumbleweeds and truck stops for miles. I had this fella riding with me about 6 rows back, one that had been staring out the window and kind of muttering to himself, at least according to a fellow passenger anyway. I couldn't hear him at first, so it must have been nothing but a few grumbles and not enough to cause a scene. But then after maybe an hour on the road, I started hearing him as he started to raise his voice. I looked up into my mirror to see folks shifting uncomfortably in their seats, but nobody said a word. That happens more often than not. People learn to tune out the oddballs on long bus rides like that, but the guy didn't get any quieter. He only got louder, and as he did, the tension in the air got thicker and thicker. My guy twisted something fierce knowing trouble was simmering, and I just prayed that it'd blow over, sort of like a false alarm, but it didn't. When it came, the guy went off like a firecracker on the 4th of July, almost like his fuse was sizzling away for a while. And then bang, off he went, and there was no stopping him. I heard someone say something to him, I guess to sort of shut up or something to that effect, and the guy replied with a full-throated roar and then went at that challenger like a freaking skunk pig. I looked back for just a second to see him leaning across the center aisle, lunging at the person I assumed did the back-talking. I had to keep my eyes on the road, but I looked up into the mirror to see fists raining down, and then the sound of passengers screaming along with a doom, doom, doom of the big guy's fists against the other's face. They weren't fighting. It was like a beating, the kind that, if it wasn't stopped, was going to end in a casket and a family dressed in black. The bus exploded into chaos as the beating continued, with some people running for cover toward the rear and others charging the attacker to try and end the assault. And when he realized what was going on, the attacker sort of wheeled around and started swinging on the folks trying to stop him. And let me tell you, this man was no small specimen. From what I could tell, he made short work of the people trying to stop him, and I think he straight up knocked a guy out too, because something freed him up to go back to wailing on the first guy he attacked, who by then was out cold and leaking blood from his nose and mouth. I didn't get a picture of all of this until later, obviously, because I was mostly trying to keep my eyes on the road while keeping an eye on the situation behind me using my driver's mirror. But then as soon as I realized the violence wasn't about to stop anytime soon, I started slowing us down so I could pull us over and get as many people as possible off that bus. I didn't hit the brakes in a sort of screaming tires kind of way. You can't do that on the bus with people standing unless you want them falling head first. And while I didn't mind if our psycho attacker banged his head on an armrest, I had to consider the other passengers too. I brought the bus to the side of the road as fast as I could, which felt painfully slow given what was happening right behind me. And then once we'd come to a stop, I opened up the doors and began hollering for people to get out as quickly as they could. I think I herded about 12 to 14 people out of the front, and there were women clutching their children, a couple of old-timers who couldn't move as fast, but everyone else moved like greased lightning. Everyone except the people trapped on the back of the bus who were being blocked from the front exit by our raging psycho. We had an emergency exit at the back of the bus, so I started yelling at the people in the back to pull the lever and push the door open so they could all scramble out onto the road. I don't know if they just couldn't hear what I was saying over the sound of their screams, or they were too scared to turn their backs on that attacker, but they didn't do as I asked. I kept on yelling louder and louder, but then the psycho turned his attention to me and then came charging down the bus while roaring like some beast. I tried to put something between us, that something being the driver's seat, but as most of you can probably imagine, all he had to do was move a yard to the side and his fists had unfettered access to my face. I felt a couple of punches and kicks, but all I could do was try and shield my head in the hopes that he didn't do any serious damage. At one point, the guy actually grabbed one of my arms by the wrist and pulled it away so he could punch me right in the eye. All it took was one punch, and it felt like I couldn't see out of it anymore, and I knew it'd only take a couple of more of that to do some serious damage. The same pattern played out again, with people trying to get him off of me before being beaten back, and then he turned back to me and started all over again, but he didn't last long because maybe a second or two later all I heard was, "Hey, right here!" It was a young voice, almost sounded a bit like a kid's, and then bam, There was a gunshot, and then I heard that attacker start to groan. I looked around, the vision in my right eye still kind of cloudy, and I saw the attacker was curled up on the floor of the bus near the exit stairs, and he was clutching at his belly with a blood stain getting bigger and bigger on his shirt. Standing over him was this black kid with a gun. And I say kid as he must have been in his late teens, probably early 20s, but there he was, standing over the guy with a smoking pistol, telling him if he tried to get up, he'd blow his head off. With the attacker put down, and with all the fight having left him, the other passengers were able to get off the bus. People were treating the kid with the gun like he was some hero, but all he seemed interested in was getting out of there. I told him to hold his horses because the cops wouldn't arrest a man for defending people like he did. But he turned to me and, with a sort of scared look in his eye, he says, "It ain't legal. It ain't legal, man. I gotta go now." And then off he went. Lord knows where, and that's honestly the last I saw of him. With folks huddled outside in the cold, yes, Texas nights can get cold, I called in what had just happened on my cell and then waited with the rest while they either cried, hugged each other, or just stared into space like I did, wondering how the heck things all went so bad so fast. And not long after, we all saw lights flashing red and blue across the flatlands, and then as they got closer, they were joined by sirens. State troopers rolled up first. Their guns were drawn so they could secure the scene, and then they gave him the lowdown on that berserker. I mentioned the shooter too, and I know I should have been honest with him, and I might have been a little selective over what I remembered because God knows I didn't want that kid's good deed treated like a bad one. Once the cops had the scene secure, the EMTs came right behind them. They hauled off that unconscious fellow with his face all busted up and then stretchered off that young woman too, the one the attacker had given a few hard licks. And they even checked the attacker too, who was still alive, but in a lot of pain, and then with him handcuffed to a stretcher, they took him away with a cop sitting in the back of the ambulance with him. The cops questioned everybody, taking statements while I stood there feeling like I'd aged a decade in about an hour. And the company I worked for got a replacement bus out to us as quickly as they could, and then once the dust settled and the authorities cleared us to go, we were back on the road again. We were minus a couple of passengers because some had chosen to wait for kin or friends so they could ride with them instead. But we were also plus one because I got to sit back and enjoy the ride with the new driver at the wheel. The atmosphere on the bus now was pretty dark, with folks whispering to each other about what had just happened. But I preferred the talk because when it came, the silence was honestly heavier than a lead blanket. I still think about that kid sometimes, the one who shot our attacker before he could do any serious damage to me. I guess if you told me about a guy like that walking around with an illegal gun, I'd have assumed that he was the bad guy. And I guess he sort of was one of the bad guys if he was a felon or what have you. But then all it took was one pull of the trigger at that right moment, and he became kind of a hero to me. I know there's no such thing as a perfect person, but since that night, I've never been so convinced of the existence of flawed heroes. Many moons ago now, back when I was a college kid with a bright future ahead of me, I volunteered as a trail guide at the McCurtain County Wilderness area down in southeast Oklahoma. Having grown up on the ranch my pa worked at, I'd always been an outdoorsy kind of guy. Not a cowboy by any stretch, but I knew which end of the bullets came out of a rifle. And I think I'd have been happy working on that ranch too, if only to stay close to family. But my pa always did want more for me, so when the time came, I decided to make him proud by becoming a lawyer. I studied at Texas A&M, then while I was there, I heard about the volunteer program. It wasn't offering any extra credit, but the university would pay my expenses, so it amounted to a sort of free spring break vacation in my native Oklahoma. The county wilderness area was a real hidden gem, with about 14,000 acres of rugged Ouachita mountain terrain stretching right up to the Arkansas state line. It's got the thick pine forest with cool, clean creeks running through them, and then all kinds of wildlife too, like deer and turkeys and the occasional black bear. It's a prime spot for hiking, fishing, all that kind of stuff. But some folks don't feel entirely comfortable out in the wilderness all alone, and that's where I came in. Now, I led groups on trails like the Beach Creek Loop or up to the overlooks to point out the native plant and bird species, along with a little Choctaw history since their roots are deep around those parts. And for the most part, all my trips out into the wilderness, including my solo ones, went perfectly fine. But then there was this one trip that I made back in the summer of 1995 that I'll never forget, and the reason that I'm writing you. I used to do a bunch of different things as a trail guide, not just guide people, and one of my favorites was what amounted to a sort of campsite scouting. We'd host a lot of overnight camping trips, mostly for younger or older folks, so we needed tried and tested places to take our guests. For example, you needed a piece of flat, solid ground large enough for at least 4 or 5 tents. It couldn't be in a low spot either, where rain could pool up and turn your site into a swamp after one of those quick Wachita storms. The ground had to be nice and clear with no overhead widowmakers either, and by that I mean dead branches or leaning trees that could crash down in a wind gust. And seeing as we were in bear country, scanning for scat, tracks, or fresh diggings were more important too, and if a place seemed active, I just moved on, because a bear encounter was not something I was willing to risk. And then once you had a spot close to water with a place for a good fire pit, it was marked on the map before being field tested, as it were. And that field testing involved one of us heading out to the proposed site and staying there overnight. On the occasion that I'm about to speak on, I was asked to check out a potential campsite around the area called He Creek. He Creek was a runoff of the Mountain Fork River and was about an 8 to 9 hour hike from where we were based. We didn't have many campsites in that area, and I agreed that we could find better ones that we already had, especially in a place with intersecting bodies of water and such varied topography. And it took me all day to get out there, and that's after hitting the trails at 7 a.m., but once I arrived, I soon found a sweet little vacation on a rise but flat peninsula which overlooked the river. It was perfect for fishing and hunting, and ideal for families with kids too, since the creek was ankle deep and the river moved nice and slow. And the only thing left to do was set up my little one-man tent, get a fire going, and see what the night brought me. I hadn't seen any bear or cougar scat, which was a big plus, but out in the wilds of southeast Oklahoma, it's not just the obvious creatures that you gotta be wary of. We've been known to get an alligator or two in the marshier regions of the southeast, and while bobcats and coyotes can be a treat to small children, rampaging herds of feral hogs pose a danger to just about anything that gets in their way, large vehicles included. And so the whole idea of staying out there overnight is to get a real feel for the place, since it's at night when the wilds really come alive. And after easily putting together a campfire, thanks to the abundance of firewood in the area, I made myself a campfire dinner and then took to reading some Call of the Wild by Headlamp. I'd read it before, but I figured that there was no better paperback for a night in the wilderness, and I'd just gotten to one of my favorite passages. Quote, "He was beaten, but he was not broken, etc., when I heard a noise about 20 to 30 yards away through the trees. I don't spook easily, and I spent enough nights outdoors to know nights can be noisy, so since all you normally need to do with an animal is let them know that you're there, all I said was, 'Howdy, y'all,' as I looked up from my book. Now, I didn't hear any more movement after that, for a couple of minutes anyway, so I figured maybe it was just a dead branch falling from a tree. But it wasn't long before I heard it again, and that time, it was even closer. Someone or something was moving through the darkness, getting closer and closer to me with each passing minute. And so I did what any other right-minded person might do in that situation, and I reached for my gun. Now, I carried a Super Red Hawk, but in a .480 Ruger, so I had a little less recoil. That was very much my choice sidearm for those oh crap moments, so I was confident that I could put down whatever charged at me. My only worry was that it wasn't an animal, and whoever was out there was similarly armed as myself. So in the off chance that that was the case, I remembered saying, "You gotta be real brave or real stupid to be sneaking up on someone who's camping after dark." Now, it served as a dual purpose. making it clear to an animal that I wasn't going anywhere, and clear to a person that I wasn't some pushover. And then when I heard the sound again just beyond the light of my campfire, sounding like it was coming from behind a nearby tree, I cocked the hammer of my Red Hawk and aimed for its trunk. My hands were shaking as I tried my best to focus on getting my breathing right, so when whatever it was came around the tree trunk, I was ready for it. But then, just as I managed to get my heart rate just a little less frantic, I heard the sound of fast-moving footsteps just off to my right. Whoever it was so fast that I didn't even have time to turn and aim at him, not without giving him a clear shot at me with whatever kind of blade he was holding. I didn't get a good look at it, but I saw it shining in the firelight as it came at me, and it gave me no choice but to basically dive over my own tent in order to put something between us. I heard him yell something as he took a single swing at me, and then by the time I was up on one knee, I only saw the back of him lit up by the campfire as he ran off into the trees again, and I wasn't about to let him get away. So I aimed, steadied myself, and then took a single Hail Mary shot at him. And that bang was so loud it had my ears ringing, and I hoped to hear him scream before tumbling into the dirt, but there was nothing. Just the faint sound of heavy footsteps as whoever it was fleeing the area. I spent the rest of that night watching my own campsite from a distance, just watching and waiting for whoever attacked me to return. Packing up and heading back wasn't really an option, as it'd give whoever was out there a really good opportunity to track my movement on account of how noisy moving around at night can be. But it also raises the question of how the hell did that person manage to approach my camp so quietly? And why the heck would a person try and murder a complete stranger like that in the middle of a wilderness area? At dawn, once it was light enough to see, I walked off in the direction my attacker had run following the encounter, and quickly found a trail of blood. I followed it for quite a distance, moving slowly and quietly with my pistol at the ready until I reached a small, chest-height cave set into a rock face. It went deep, but I only went in for enough to see where the blood trail ended, and there were all kinds of animal bones in there. Random pieces of camping trash too, like empty cans and plastic water bottles. But unless they were hiding at the very rear of the cave, seeing my flashlight and keeping quiet as a mouse, I don't figure anyone was in there at that time. I got back to the compound about 9 hours later in the mid-afternoon. I went straight to my boss, told him what happened, and that's why they stopped taking camping parties up near He Creek. The local sheriff said that he'd keep an ear to the ground and I was well within my right to shoot at him, but in all likelihood, they probably wouldn't find the guy with so little to go on. Now, I'm not sure if they found the blood trail and took a sample or whatever they might do. Hell, I'm not even sure they sent anyone out there at all, really. But it just goes to show you that even when you're out there in the middle of nowhere, it's not just the bears you gotta worry about. It's the men. More than 20 years ago now, back when my son James was still in elementary school, we took a trip down to Bethesda, Maryland from New York so he could see his grandma. Now, it was kind of messed up from the start, I guess, because I had something come up at work on the Friday we planned to leave. And this meant that I couldn't get on the road until about 8:30 in the evening, meaning I wouldn't arrive in Bethesda till after midnight at the latest. Now, I called ahead to my mom and made sure that was all okay, and she wasn't happy at having less time with her grandson, but there really wasn't much that could be done. And so after getting her to agree to stay up later than usual, me and James hit the road. About 2 hours into the journey, I stopped at a little gas station in Maryland when I realized I needed a coffee and a bite to eat. James was asleep in the back seat and I was worried about waking him up as I shut my car door, but he was still at that age where when he was out, and his eyes stayed closed after I shut the door. I got one of those big, super strong gas station coffees, a soda for James, and then a bag of those mini powdered donuts because I knew all that sugar would push me through the rest of the way. And then after walking back to my car, I found James was awake. And thinking that shutting my car door really had woken him up, I apologized and then turned in my seat to hand him his drink. And that's when I saw the key ring that he was now holding. At first glance, it looked like a little clown holding a sign of some description. And I asked him what it was while taking a look at it and saw how the clown's little sign read, "Flying Plow Circus." It wasn't plastic either, like it was mass-produced. It was wooden and looked almost handmade. And when I asked James where he got it, he said a man had given it to him. Now, naturally, this didn't ring any alarm bells at first, and I was about to just let it go. But then I asked when the man gave it to him, to which James replied, "A minute ago, while you were in the store." Again, this didn't scare me like it should have, because I'd locked my door. Now, I'd never leave my kid in an unlocked car like that while I went into a store, and since sleepy 6-year-olds aren't the most reliable and frequently play pretend, I didn't really take them seriously. But that's when James said something along the lines of, "Yeah, he did something funny to the door, like, then it opened, then he told us to go visit sometime." Now, I remember my pulse getting faster as I asked James if he was serious and if he was sure. He told me he wasn't lying, and that the man used some kind of wire to open the door. Now, by the time he said that, my heart felt like it was about to burst out of my chest. I asked what the guy looked like, and James just said, "Normal." And then as I got out of my car and looked around the parking lot, I don't think I'd ever been so close to a panic attack in my whole life. I tried to calm myself down as best I could, and then I asked James to tell me the whole story again from start to finish. He was starting to pick up on my vibe, so he was starting to get all confused and kind of upset, and I had to assure him that he hadn't done anything wrong and that he just needed to tell me what happened, and then he went over it with me a second time. It made my skin crawl to think about, and it still does. The thought of some creep watching people, waiting for an opportunity to break into someone's car so they could creep on their kid. Like, I know all the guy did was give James a key ring, but that's his cover story, right? All he's doing is giving the kid a key ring till the parents take too long coming back, and then it's diddling or abduction time. I asked James if he said or did anything weird, or if he acted in a weird or creepy way, and James said the only weird thing he said was, "Your dad knows me." And even though he was 6, he was skeptical seeing that we didn't even live there. I was freaked out, y'all. The idea of what might have happened scared the hell out of me, but once I saw that there was no one around for me to blame, that fear turned to frustration and then straight up anger. I think if James had pointed someone out like that's him, I'd have straight up torched that dude, and I'd be writing this from prison or something. Not that a jury in their mother effing land would convict me of something like that, but you see my point. I told James to hand me the key ring, and then told him if anything like that ever happened again, he should yell for me, as loud as he could, and he wasn't to stop until I'd appeared to protect him. I told him he'd been very brave and he hadn't done anything wrong, and then gave him the speech on how not everyone who acts friendly wants to be friends. And then once all that was said and done and my heart rate had returned to normal, sort of, we got back on the road again. I remembered the name of the road that I was on a couple of minutes later because I looked it up later when I decided to call the cops. It was called Conowingo Road, a name I don't think I'll ever forget because I was driving down and I saw the sign saying Flying Plow Circus 1 mile ahead. I remember how the rage boiled up in me like you wouldn't believe, and I actually put my foot down thinking, I'm going to give these a-holes a piece of my mind. I powered along the highway, probably dipping over the speed limit a couple of times, till I finally found the sign saying Flying Plow Circus next right. I don't know exactly what I was planning. Maybe just find where the carnies' trailers were, then curse up a storm on how they needed to keep a leash on their pedo co-workers before he gets himself shot. I wasn't dumb enough to start a fight with a whole bunch of random circus folk, and I wasn't about to let their buddy get away with what he did either. But then after making the turn and driving down this dark dirt road to where a circle of trailers were sat, I changed my mind completely. If I could describe that collection of trailers in 2 words, those 2 words would be horror and movie. And there was a fire in the middle of them and a bunch of people gathered around it. And then when they saw my car, I saw a couple of them turn to look at me. I couldn't make much out. They were just these dark shapes with the fire in the background, but that made them even creepier looking. I realized that it might not be a case of one rogue carny, and for all I know, the whole gang might have sent that one guy out looking for a kid to snatch and bring back to them. Now, I just kept on watching them, watching me for maybe half a minute more, and then after taking one look at James in the back, who by then had fallen back asleep, I thought, screw this, and then turned around and drove off. Now, before James was born, if something like that happened where someone made me mad enough to hunt them down, then yeah, maybe I'd have gotten my car and been dumb enough to get my ass kicked by a dozen pissed-off carnival folk. But after he was born, it was like I had this safety software installed onto my brain where everything I did sparked the thought of, how is this going to end for me? There was no point trying to defend him from something I wouldn't survive confronting, because being a parent is literally all about living to fight another day. Life's not a game anymore for me. I have to do everything I can to protect my kid, and it's just scary as hell when you try and do all the right things and still end up with some creep breaking into your car. I called the cops from my mom's place that next day after telling her all about the man, the key ring, and all the signs from the Flying Plow Circus. They called me back basically saying that they'd been stonewalled and that no one admitted to slipping out from their camp after dark, not even for a second. And that's what confirmed it for me. If they were just a bunch of innocent, good-natured carnies just making their way in the world, then I doubt that they'd have stonewalled a pair of cops who came around asking about a kitty creeper. If there was some sketchy loner on my crew and I thought that they were up to no good, and I mean really up to no good, I'd want them gone. So the fact that they all sort of said, "I don't know what you're talking about, officers," and that made me think that they were in on it and they were just covering for their boy. On the journey back from my mom's and while driving in daylight, I slowed near that turn that I'd seen the trailers on but didn't see any signs for the Flying Plow Circus. Now, I'm guessing that they moved on after the visit from the cops, and after looking it up, I don't think the whole Flying Plow thing was their regular name. Flying Plow something, I can't remember if it was a road or a lane or whatever, was the name of the place that they set up on, so wherever they went, they'd probably put up some new signs and under a new name, and then on they'd go. I don't even know if they were running an actual circus. I saw plenty of trailers, but no big top. But what I do know is that one of them went out looking for kids, and almost certainly for no good reason at all. Almost 10 years ago now, way back in September of 2016, I drove all the way from LA to Phoenix to visit an old high school friend. Now, I was 31 and female, but still Hispanic and still small, and I drove out on a Friday and we spent all day Saturday together. Then, even though I planned to drive back home in the mid-afternoon on Sunday, I didn't end up leaving until about 9 p.m. at night. Now, I know I should have left earlier, and I know what I'm about to tell you is basically my own damned fault for not sticking to my plan. But even so, there are still nights sometimes, even all this time later, when I find myself waking up from nightmares with a cold sweat forming on my chest, having relived it all over again in my sleep. It was just after midnight when I rolled into Riverside County after passing over the Arizona state line. Now, a few people were still up in that area, so it wasn't completely dead, but after I passed the airport and the Mesa Verde complex, the 10 got super quiet again, and it seemed like there was no one but me out there for miles and miles. I was just trying to keep myself awake with some music and by blasting some cold air when suddenly I noticed a pair of headlights in my rear view. Someone was coming up on me, and really fast too, and seeing how fast they were going, I honestly figured it was the police. I didn't panic or anything, I wasn't doing anything wrong, and I didn't have anything in the car that I shouldn't have, and so I just sat tight, kept my speed, and let them get closer and closer. When they got so close their headlights were blinding me if I looked up into the rear view, I figured they'd pass and keep going. But they stayed put, right behind me in the same lane and didn't budge for at least a couple of minutes. I'm trying to figure out if these guys really are cops because it looked like they were driving in one of those big sliding door vans. Only this one was all blacked out, like even the windows looked like they were tinted. Now, there was nothing on it to say that they were police and no lights on the top either, so I started getting really nervous thinking, what the hell do these guys want with me? Like I said, they stayed behind me like that for a couple of minutes, and then by the time they dropped back a little, they sped up to try and pass me, and I was actually super relieved. Now, I thought because they weren't trying to follow anymore, I was out of danger, when in reality, I was in more danger than I could have ever even imagined. I just let them pass, because what the heck was I going to do? But then instead of passing me and speeding off, the black van pulled back into the same lane as me and then started cruising maybe 10 to 15 minutes in front like it was trying to block me. I thought, oh, big deal, right? Like I could just slow down and lose them. But I didn't think that I'd need to, so I didn't. I stayed right where I was, slowing only a little to just a safe distance between us, and then kept on cruising just like the van was. Oh, I had no idea what they were up to, and I think maybe curiosity really did almost kill the cat here, because when the van's rear doors swung open and I saw a man in leathers with some kind of bandana wrapped around his face, I kind of just froze up. I couldn't think of a single good reason why he'd want to open the back doors like that, and for a second I thought that he might be planning on jumping out for some reason. I don't know what I was thinking. All I did was lean on the brake a little and put just a little more feet between myself and that van. I just had no idea that I'd moved right where he wanted me. I dropped back a little more, still wondering what the hell these guys were doing and why they didn't have any plates on the back of their van. I then watched as the man with the bandana around his mouth began to smile at me. I obviously couldn't see his mouth, but I could see it in his eyes. That or the dust was getting to him, because it's like he squinted before turning his back on me and carefully leaning down to grab something. Now, I might sound crazy or dumb to y'all who are reading this back in almost slow-mo, and maybe I was just too tired and slow or naive as heck, but I could not conceive of what he was about to do next, no matter how obvious it seems looking back on it. And so I just watched as the guy hauled something up into his arms, turned around, and then tossed it out onto the freeway in front of him. I saw what it was way too late, and I guess that moment of panic really did slow me down, but I had just enough in me to turn the wheel at just the right moment, so that when that old engine block came bouncing up off the blacktop, it smashed into my windshield on the passenger side and not into me. And once it hit, instinct told me to slam on the brakes, and so that's what I did, bringing my car to a spinning, screeching stop. Before I realized that I was covered in glass and there was basically a giant gaping hole where my windshield used to be. I just remember sitting there and shaking after I turned off my engine, and then I got out, walked to the side of the highway with my phone and dialed 911. And it wasn't until I described exactly what had happened as calmly as I could that I suddenly just broke down when the operator told me to stay on the line while she transferred me to someone. And after that, it was a case of guiding the cops and EMS to where I was so I could be taken to the ER. Aside from a few cuts and some mild whiplash, I was pretty much good to go, but I was reminded of just how lucky I'd been by that doctor. The cops had said the same thing, and that's why I say reminded, but at the time, it didn't all the way feel lucky, and it wouldn't for quite some time. I knew I was lucky to be alive, and it wasn't like I was completely blind to how lucky I'd been in that respect, but all I could think about in the months afterwards was, why me? Like, why did they pick me of all the people they could have picked to throw a damn engine at? Like, I know they were trying to kill me. I just want to know what it was about me that made them think, yeah, this is the one. Let's turn her into hamburger meat. The cops didn't find that van or the people inside it, and I don't mean any disrespect to the boys in blue when I say this, but I didn't have much faith that they would. It was a black van, no plates, traveling in the middle of the damn night in the middle of the damn desert, and it might as well have been a ghost. And that fits too, because you know something? It sure as heck haunts me like one. So I used to drive taxis in Liverpool back in the 80s. Now, it was great money for what it was, and so even though I only planned on doing it long enough to find a replacement for the job I'd lost, I ended up driving for almost 3 years before I finally gave up. A big appeal was that I could work when I wanted. If I had something that I needed doing in the daytime, be it something with the kids' school or whatever, I could just take a few hours off, take care of business, and then head out on the jobs again at night to make up the hours. And there was no doing that in a factory or down on the docks, not without getting your pay docked anyway. But it wasn't all sunshine and roses, and I remember one particular job where for a minute or two, it didn't look like I was going to make it home to my family that night. It started when a job came through just after 10 p.m., asking me to take someone from Agberth Vale to Anfield. I got the address, drove over, and then parked up outside a small 2 up, 2 down on a dark and quiet street. I didn't want to beat my horn, which was the usual method of letting a customer know that we were outside, so I gave dispatch a buzz on my radio and asked them to call the customer back to let them know that I was waiting. Dispatch said no one picked up the phone, but then maybe a second or two later, I saw someone walking out of a house and towards my car. Now, as I said, it was dark, so even though I saw the shape of them moving towards the back passenger door, I didn't get a good look at them until they were sitting behind me. And when I did, I almost pissed my kecks. He was wearing a balaclava, and after he shut the door, he sank down low in the seat to make it harder for him to be seen from the outside. Now, he had what looked like a jerry can of petrol in one gloved hand, and then with the other, he pulled out what looked like an old detective gun from his jacket, like a proper six-shooter, and pointed it directly at me. He said if I tried to run, I'd be shot. In fact, if I did anything that even remotely upset him, I was a dead man. Now, my only job was to do what he said, and when he said it, and if I did, I'd go home alive that night. And so, seeing as I didn't have much of a choice, I drove where he told me to go. We ended up parked up across from a pub not far from the Rialto on Upper Parliament Street, I remember. And the lad in the back told me to turn off the engine and then spent the next 15 minutes or so checking his watch and peering up over the solid part of the door to watch the pub through the window. He kept on checking his watch, and I kept getting the urge to try and talk him out of whatever he was about to do. But every time the words were about to come out, something stopped them. I stayed quiet, and then noticed that when the clock on my dash hit 11 p.m., the lad in the back started getting even twitchier. When I noticed people coming out of the pub, obviously around kick-out time, the lad told me to start the engine. He was watching the pub doors like a hawk, and then suddenly, he started rolling down the window all frantically before he pointed the gun out the window, shouted something I couldn't make out, and pulled the trigger. One of the fellas who just walked out of the pub hit the concrete like a wet sack of spuds. Someone screamed, and then the guy in the back seat let out a scream of his own as he told me to drive. I obviously had to stay under the speed limit where possible, but it was tough with a gun pressed in the back of my head every so often, with its owner telling me that if I stopped for the police or took us down any dead ends, I'd be getting one to the back of the dome. The lad directed me to drive all the way out towards Speke to some of the derelict land near where the airport is today. He told me to get out of the car and then started emptying that can of petrol all over the seats after joining me outside. And that was the closest I had got to trying to do something when I realized that I was about to lose my car. I know that probably sounds horrible, seeing as I didn't do anything about him shooting that fella outside the pub, but I wasn't really in any position to do anything back then. Whereas watching him pour that gasoline with his back to me, I knew that there was a very slim chance that I'd be able to get the drop on him. But if I didn't, I was a dead man. And so I basically talked myself out of it in my head and then watched as he set my car on fire and then ran off into the darkness. I just remember feeling numb. Less than an hour before, I hadn't even received the job yet. And then just a short while after parking outside that house to pick them up, my life had been changed forever. We obviously didn't have any phones back then, so I couldn't just call the police with a mobile like I would now. I had to walk all the way to a payphone, which took quite a while before I could contact the police, and only then could I give them any details. All I wanted to do was go home, get in the bath, and crack open one of the beers that I had waiting for me in the fridge. But the police wanted me to wait where I was so I could guide them to where my car had been dumped. It honestly didn't take all that long, and I'm grateful the police got out to me so fast, but the last thing in the world I wanted to do was go back to where my car was still smoldering and repeat my story for a second time. But I had to, because the most important thing was making it really bloody clear that my part in the murder was an unwilling one, and I did that by giving them as much info as possible on the man that had done the shooting. But when they asked if I'd be willing to appear in a court at a later date, I told them no. Call me a coward, but to me, you'd have to be mental to testify against some gangster in this city. Maybe if I was in London or New York or somewhere like that, but not Liverpool, because everyone knows everyone around here. And they said that I might get asked again if murder detectives were put on the case and they found someone they wanted to charge. But the fact that I never got that call is the only proof that I need that they didn't catch anyone. I used to have nightmares about it too, proper horrible ones as well. But nowadays I just have these dreams. Not quite nightmares, but still clear enough for me to remember when I wake up in the morning. And sometimes in those dreams I do what I wanted to do in the moment and beg the killer to reconsider. But no matter what I say and no matter how I say it, he never, ever listens. I was raised in West Texas, a trailer park by a single mom, and the rest is summed up by a couple of lines from a Merle Haggard song. Dear old daddy, rest his soul, left my mom a heavy load. She tried so very hard to fill his shoes, working hours without rest, wanted me to have the best. She tried to raise me right, but I refused. People said my daddy was wild, and I guess I sprung from that same bad seed. But while my buddies were picking poisons like dope or booze or women, I got hooked on something altogether different. Adrenaline. I was a junkie for it ever since I stood up to my middle school bully. He beat 7 shades of crap out of me, but I landed the sweetest right hook right on his fat face before he did, and afterwards, I felt so good I could have strut sitting down. He didn't bother me anymore after that, and I didn't see enough high school for anyone else to make the same mistake. But when I heard my little cousin was being hassled at high school, I just about jumped at the chance to trim some tail feathers, so to speak. And that, ladies and germs, was the first time I robbed anybody. My freshman cousin had a toy cap gun shaped like a pearl handle revolver, and it was his pride and joy, but I guess it was his own damn fault for taking a toy into high school because he got it snatched off of him almost right away. He kept his trap shut about it for weeks, so by the time I found out, there was no getting the cap gun back. But when I found the bully, I made him empty his pockets. I took his sneakers, and I even took the shirt off his damn back. And that was an even bigger rush than socking my bully in his fat, pudgy face. And I guess that was my career decider right there. The way other kids see a Marine in his dress blues or a roughneck manhandling his rig and think, damn, that's what I want to be when I grow up. I robbed that kid and I thought, hell, I could get used to this. And I started off in earnest when I was 16, stealing cars and robbing houses so I wouldn't have to get a real job. And then by the time I started hanging out in bars and meeting the right people, I got involved in much more organized sorts of crime. I started robbing trucks with a guy who called himself TJ because all we had to do was wait to see which truckers picked up a lot lizard and then raid their cargo when the cab was shaking. And that made us some good money for a while, but as we got older and started racking up bills, we needed to graduate to something a little more rewarding. We started robbing gas stations, bars, and pawn shops, anything that would net us a clean 4 or 5 figures if we hit the safe on deposit day. And then as we started hitting bigger and bigger places, we brought on a guy called Jody for crowd control. Now this was my crew for about 3 years, and we'd hit a place maybe once every couple of months if conditions were just right. But then for this one job of robbing a small credit union, Jody wasn't available, and after shopping around, TJ said that he'd found a replacement in the form of a guy named Vincent. Before we did anything with Vincent, I wanted a face-to-face. And so we met for some steak and potatoes over at this little place outside of Odessa. And TJ said that he was a big guy, pretty sharp too, meaning that he'd be the perfect replacement for Jody while he was out of state. And then when he walked through the door of that steak place, I couldn't have agreed more. The guy was terrifying, not just because of how big he was, and he had to be scraping at least 7 feet with his boots on, but because of the way he carried himself, like he was meaner than a skillet full of rattlesnakes. I'm not easy to frighten, but having Vincent sitting across from me with his long and wild-looking beard, it had me feeling like Dobby in a glue trap. He had this way of looking at you that felt like he was peeking right into your head, just sort of quietly figuring you out. Vincent said he had some military experience, just not with the US military, and that he had connections in the Aryan nations after doing a little time over in New Mexico. He didn't have a problem working in a crew, and he didn't mind doing things our way if we organized the job right. And the only thing that struck me as sketchy was when he said that he couldn't talk about the time that he served in that other country's military. That kind of set off my bullcrap detector, but if all we needed him to do was stand there and look mean, then he'd be just fine. We ended up hitting this little credit union about a week later, and unlike a lot of the bigger unions or bank chains, the manager proved a tough nut to crack. A teller in a big bank chain is just there to collect a paycheck, but a small-town credit union manager, that's his whole life that you're stamping on. He knows his customers, they're his neighbors, and he likes them too. But what he doesn't like is no-account robbers like us thinking that we can have something for nothing. A small-town credit union manager might think twice, maybe even 3 times before handing over the keys or codes, and in a profession like mine, seconds meant safety. And the more you racked up during that crucial part of a job, the more danger of getting busted there was. And the one of the job that I'm talking about was no different. It was my job to get him to hand over the keys while TJ and Vincent watched the door and worked crowd control. And right away, just from the look in the manager's eyes, I knew that he wasn't going to play ball. I ended up bashing him over the head with my pistol a few times just to show that I was serious. I can't say that I'm altogether proud of that, but like I said, seconds mean safety. He took 1 hit, and then another, and he still didn't break. I was getting worried that he might not break at all until Vincent pointed at one of the 2 tellers working at the place and asked if she was the man's daughter. No, the manager was a lily-white Texan, while the teller looked like her parents came from Mexico or maybe further south. So when Vincent first suggested that she was the manager's daughter, I thought to myself, what are you smoking? But when I turned back to the manager, he had this look of pure terror in his eyes. Vincent smiled, jumped over the counter, and then started tearing at the buttons on the girl's blouse, saying that he was going to do all this obscene stuff to her right in front of her dad. The manager just about lost his mind and promised to hand over the keys if Vincent promised not to touch her. And that was all it took, and we were out of there with a whole bunch of cash just a few minutes later. I later asked Vincent if he was serious, if he really would have done all those things that he talked about to make the manager hand over the keys. Now he just smiled that big wolfish smile of his and said, "Whatever it takes to get the job done, brother. Whatever it takes." Now I had no doubt in my mind that he meant what he said, and I don't think I've ever met anyone who was so obviously a dyed-in-the-wool psycho. But little did I know, I hadn't seen nothing yet. The next job we did with Vincent, we hit up a little savings bank just outside of San Antonio. One of the Mexican supervisors, who we needed to open up the safety deposit boxes, had some kind of meltdown and forgot all of her English. Maybe she did it on purpose to slow us down, or maybe it was genuine, who knows. But what I do know is that out of nowhere, Vincent steps up and starts straight up speaking fluent Spanish to her. Now he's not just talking Spanish either, he's talking to this chick like he's her damned uncle or something, trying to almost soothe and relax her. And you know something? It worked. She freezes up, stops screeching like a whistle, and then just looks at him as he gives his little speech. And then when he's done, she hands over the keys to the boxes, and once again, we're making our getaway in minutes flat. We all wanted to know what he said to that lady, but Vincent calmly explained that all he did was tell her what would happen if she didn't hand over those keys. That San Antonio bank job was the last we saw of Vincent for a little while. He said he had some business out of state, but that he was working on something in the meantime, and he'd let us know if he could use our help. And we said we appreciated him keeping us in mind, but to be honest, we were more than happy to go our separate ways. Vincent got the job done all right, but at the same time, he felt like a liability, like it was only going to be a matter of time before he did something terrible. Like what he said he was fixing to do to that guy's daughter right there in front of him. And maybe 9 months later, TJ gets a call from Vincent about that job that he said he was casing. I was in TJ's place when he got the call, and the second he said, "Oh, hey Vincent, how's your mom and them?" I got to rolling my eyes thinking, crap, here we go again. Now there came a point in the conversation when TJ started sounding a little skeptical, saying stuff like, "I don't know, Vincent, sounds like a lot." But then Vincent said something to him, something I didn't hear, which made him look like Jesus Christ himself had just talked down that phone to him. Now his eyes went very wide and his jaw dropped a little, and he stayed very quiet for a long time before setting up a meeting. And I remember driving out to the diner with TJ and trying to figure out what was going on. Now he kept saying stuff like, "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," or "You're better off hearing it from the horse's mouth." He also said if he told me what Vincent had in mind, I'd probably duck and roll out of the car, and that's when I asked him to at least tell me what kind of job they'd talked about. TJ kept his eyes on the road but told me, "The last one before we retire." And after that, it was my turn to stay quiet and just stew in the mystery until we got to the diner. And when we got there, Vincent was leaning over this big plate of steak and eggs, eating it like he hadn't in weeks. And we asked him where he'd been, and he tells us, Mexico. And then explains how he's been eyeing up the score of a goddamn lifetime, just like TJ said. He'd been tracking these cash couriers south of the border for weeks, casing their routes, figuring out their schedules, and then putting together enough firepower to make the job doable. I asked him what kind of firepower we needed, if all we wanted to do was scare a couple of couriers, but he said to do that, we needed something that'd pierce armor. The golden rule of armed robbery is to not kill anyone, because then you're a murderer and the cops will hunt you like one. We don't use armored piercing anything because the best jobs are the kind where bullets don't get fired, and so when Vincent mentioned armor piercing, my ass was halfway out the door. But then he started talking about how to get the couriers to stop, we needed to at least demonstrate that we could pierce the armor on their trucks, and without that, they just roll through the ambush without stopping and they get away. Now, I guess I had it in my head that this was a regular job, and when I say regular, I mean your standard armored car job. So when Vincent said that the couriers were carrying some cash illegally across the border and were doing it for the Sinaloa cartel, I thought he'd lost his damned mind. Now, I feel like just about everyone in America knows who the cartel are these days, but the Sinaloa stand tall even among their fellow narcos. They're one of the oldest in Mexico, and at the time, they were by far the most powerful too. They were led by the El Chapo guy for a while, and they don't mess around when it comes to protecting their operations. And so when Vincent suggested we rob them, I figured it'd be quicker to just shoot each other in the face right there and then, because if we robbed the cartel, that's how we were going to end up. Dead as buzzard bait. But Vincent said he had a plan. At the time, the Sinaloa cartel was at war with the Juarez cartel. Couriers were getting robbed and their hitmen were dying by the dozen, but it was all just one big mess down there. But that meant, at least according to Vincent, that the Sinaloa wouldn't suspect a foursome of gringos to be responsible for robbing one of the couriers, at least not unless directed by their enemies in Juarez. And to him, it was foolproof, and if we did the job right, we could bring home enough laundered cash to retire on. We wouldn't have to worry about washing it. We wouldn't have to worry about anyone coming after us. All we'd have to do is figure out what kind of porch swing we wanted to sit our asses down on until we were old enough to die, and figure out which kind of beer we wanted to drink while we were doing it. I didn't realize how much I wanted out until I saw the crack in the door, and I guess it was the same for TJ and Jody too, because after thinking on it for all of 30 seconds, we decided to go for it. About a week later, we all met up with Vincent just before midnight for the long-ass drive down to the ambush site. Vincent's plan was relatively simple. At dawn, when the couriers approached our position in their 2 trucks, we'd pull up a heavy chain across the dirt road, kill their engines with our armor-piercing bullets, and then keep on shooting until any guards were dead and the driver surrendered. When I asked him how he was so sure the drivers would just surrender, Vincent said that they were just that, drivers. They'd give themselves up once they realized that they were in trouble. Now I started getting doubts because if those drivers lost all that cash, the cartel weren't going to just slap them on the back and say, "Better luck next time, hombre." They'd torture those guys first just to make sure that they weren't in on the scam. And then even if they weren't, they'd carve them up and hang them from a bridge just to make an example out of them. And the more I thought about it, the more I got this bad feeling in the pit of my stomach. But even when that feeling got so intense I wanted to puke, I'd push it back down again and tell myself, get this right, and you're home free. No more jobs, no more Vincent, no more worrying about anything ever again. And it was that which kept my mouth shut during that drive across the border. It was still dark as we set up, tying the chain to a tree before covering it with a thin layer of dirt. We dug little holes too on a low rise near the road, with one a little closer than the others so whoever was in it could pull the chain up and block the couriers. And after that, it was just a case of waiting and watching and hoping those couriers didn't decide to rearrange their run at the last minute. Now we waited hours, watching the sun get higher and higher and feeling the air get warmer. Now Vincent said the trucks would roll by about an hour after dawn. But then 2 hours had gone by and there wasn't a truck to be seen, and I started to doubt that they were ever going to show up at all. Now by around 8 a.m. we were all sweating buckets, barely able to hear our own thoughts above all the noise that the cicadas were making. But then after maybe an hour of sweat and frustration, I remember seeing this glint of light on the horizon as 2 white trucks came into view. We started hooping and hollering a little, having sat in those dusty holes for so damn long, and Vincent told us to shut the hell up and be ready. Now as we watched the trucks getting closer and closer, TJ took hold of the chain, waiting for Vincent's signal to start yanking it up into the roadway. But when it came, and TJ forced those trucks to hard brake as it rose up, Vincent didn't aim for the engine blocks. He aimed right for the truck's tinted windows, and then unleashed hell. Someone in the second truck managed to get a few shots off, but Jody was ready with his AK, and it was pure chaos, but it was over in seconds. So quick that me and TJ didn't even get time to fire a shot. And then once the smoke had cleared and everything went quiet again except for the groans of the dying couriers, we made our move. As we ran towards the trucks, I remember TJ yelling about Vincent not having to shoot everyone. Vincent said what's done is done and he should shut his mouth and get to work. TJ had only just unlocked the second truck's storage and we were about to go rummaging around in the back when we suddenly heard the sound of a child crying. In a way that only a kid's cry can grab your attention like that, me and TJ ended up spinning around on the spot to see where the voices were coming from. I remember seeing Jody, wide-eyed, looking into the truck in front and then seeing Vincent open up one of the back doors and start speaking in Spanish. TJ had a daughter who stayed with his mom, so realizing that there had been kids in that lead truck just about sent him off the handle. He marched over to where Vincent was speaking Spanish to them and asked what he was doing. Vincent said he was telling them to stay in the trucks because someone would be coming by to get them before long. TJ didn't like that one bit on account of we all know what happens to kids or dogs when they're locked in hot cars. Him and Vincent went at it for about a minute, going back and forth about how those kids needed to be safe, and Vincent thought about it for a moment and then said we could just drop them off at a gas station or something once we got back on American soil. TJ didn't much like that idea either, but just like the whole surrendering drivers thing, I don't think Vincent was ever really planning on doing what he said. Because as me and Jody are hauling a big bag of cash back towards the place we'd hidden our own truck, we heard 2 gunshots and then the sound of TJ screaming. We dropped the bag of cash where we were and then ran back to see what was going on. I thought TJ might have gotten himself shot, possibly by a courier who wasn't dead as we thought he was. But when we got to the top of that rise and we saw why TJ was still screaming at Vincent and calling him all the curse words under the sun, he'd taken those 2 Mexican kids out of the truck and he'd shot them both in the head. Vincent was probably a head and shoulder taller than TJ and almost twice as heavy too. But after what he did, shooting those 2 kids, TJ went at him like a monster. Vincent had to point his pistol just to get him to back off, but TJ lost his vertical and was yelling, "Why? Why?" What'd they do to you, huh? What'd they do? And Vincent started saying how the cartel could be on our asses if they talked. But this was after telling us about the war between the cartels and how they'd never know it was us. I still don't know for sure if that was really all nonsense or if he just switched his plan up at the last minute. But those kids, man, they didn't have to die. Only one person had to die down at that dirt road in Mexico, and it sure as hell wasn't those kids. And when Vincent finished giving his little speech on how this was just too much money at stake to take any chances, he turned his back on TJ to go grab one of the bags. TJ then pulled his pistol and shot Vincent about 4 or 5 times in the back. And he hit the dirt, gasping for air. Then walked over to him. TJ put him down with one shot to the head. Me and Jody didn't freak out. Not like we'd done when we saw those kids lying there with the dirt soaking up their brains. What TJ did felt natural, almost. No one questioned him. We just grabbed all the cash we could carry, loaded it into the truck, and then took off back towards the border. We didn't celebrate the money. We couldn't. Even when we got someplace safe and realized our shares tallied up to just under $1 million each, we were too exhausted to do anything but sit quietly with a few beers and wonder how the hell it all went so wrong. Those kids weren't like 12 or 13. They were small. Too small to even talk, I really think, and they wouldn't have been able to tell us 4 gringos apart from the boys in ZZ Top. So why'd Vincent kill them? I remember asking that question out loud, but TJ'd had enough, and after stomping out a cigarette, he told me it didn't matter, because that son of a bitch was dead. And then off he went to pack his share of the money. Now once we were all packed up and we agreed to lay low for a while, Jody went to stay with his parents in Oklahoma while TJ took an extended vacation in New Orleans, and I went to stay with a girl that I'd been seeing for what amounted to a very low-key retirement party. I didn't tell her about Vincent or the kids, I just said I was done. Now she'd always wanted me to walk the line and get a real job, so the news was music to my ears. And she told me to stay as long as I needed, and then maybe 3 weeks later, TJ showed up again driving a new Dodge. Now it wasn't new, but we couldn't exactly go driving around in the same truck we used for the robbery, so it was a practical purchase. We went for a drive and caught up on things, and then TJ asked if I wanted to go get a burger or something later. I said sure, and we arranged for me to stop by his place around 7. Now it felt like we were starting fresh. We wouldn't have to look over our shoulder anymore. Work wasn't a topic of conversation we'd ever really have to touch on again, and we'd had more money than we could ever spend without pissing it away. It felt like we could just stop surviving and start living, and it was strange to find myself grinning like a mule eating cockleburrs over nothing but a burger with an old buddy. He dropped me back off at my place, and then after a few hours of chilling with my girl, I drove over to TJ's place and knocked on the door. And that Dodge was parked in the driveway, but when I knocked on his door, there was no answer. It was almost exactly 7, and he wasn't the kind of guy to flake on plans like that, and so assuming he was probably just running late and was in the shower or something, I walked around to the yard and tried the back door. TJ never locked his back door, ever. He always left it open in case we needed a place to crash, and he also wasn't keeping his share of the money there either, so right away I knew something was off. I'd crashed there a bunch before, so I knew that there was a way to jimmy open a window or the first floor, but after getting it open and climbing inside, I felt my stomach drop. And that old cliche about the smell of blood, how it sort of hangs in the air, very heavy in places where a lot of it's been spilled, it's as true as steel, especially on a warm Texas evening. And the smell of blood in TJ's house was so strong I felt the shiver run up my spine as I realized something really, really bad had gone down. And as I ran through the house, I started yelling out his name and asking where he was. I found him in the upstairs bathroom, curled up in the tub, and he wasn't just dead. It looked like someone had tried to take him apart. I didn't look for long. I couldn't. But from what little I saw, he had his fingers missing, part of his face was gone, and someone had carved off a big patch of skin away from his side, so much so that I could see a couple of his ribs peeking through. That's the snapshot I can't ever get out of my head, even though I must have looked for no more than a second. I didn't stay long. I just slipped out the way I came in, ran back to my truck, and drove straight over to Jody's place to tell him what I'd found. Someone had come looking for us. We knew that much, and we agreed the best thing to do in the meantime was hide out someplace. Jody said he could find us a place in Oklahoma, somewhere real quiet and out of the way, but we still needed to square some stuff away at home first. We needed to get the money, and we warned folks who needed warning. Then, we could meet at a motel just outside of town and drive to Oklahoma from there. Now, it sounded like a smart enough plan. Have a base of operations just outside of town for a few hours and then be gone by the evening. But after driving all over town and making sure my girl got herself to her mom's, I arrived at the motel to feel my stomach drop a second time. There were cops outside the room Jody said he'd be in and police tape across the open door. There were EMTs too, and I didn't see them walking around, but their ambulance was there and it was all I needed to see to know that they'd gotten Jody too. I left town right away, tail between my legs, but with the money sitting in the trunk of my car. I planned on going back. I'd still got family down in Texas, but once I got to Oklahoma and found a motel, I saw a news report on TV. It was about Jody, but it wasn't just hearing about his murder that scared me so bad. It was the description a witness had given the police, which became the basis for their person of interest appeal. But it was that which made me feel like the devil himself was standing right there next to me, laughing his ass off at a joke I didn't get. Because when the newscaster read out the man's description, being that of a tall, stocky man with long hair and a wild-looking beard, it sounded almost exactly like Vincent. Someone matching that description had been seen in the motel's parking lot acting strange. Then around the same time as the murders, the same person was said to have hopped in a truck and driven away from the scene at some very serious speed. But then, Vincent wasn't the only guy in Texas to have a long-ass beard and a ponytail, so that all could have been a coincidence, right? But then what are the chances of the same person sporting an oversized hat and a bunch of bandages around his head? I had never been so freaked out in my whole life, and I'd never been in a situation where I actually considered pinching myself because I was half convinced that I'd wake up to discover that the whole thing was just some horrible nightmare. But it wasn't a dream. It was real, and I found myself faced with a very real possibility that Vincent had somehow survived TJ's attempt to kill him and had come to get his revenge. Looking back on it, I realized that it was much more likely to be the cartel and that somehow they figured out a way to track us down. But just the thought of some half-dead Vincent walking around looking like he'd crawled out of a grave, it sent shivers up my spine even all these years later. I live someplace else now, just about as far from Texas as it's possible to get without having to learn another language. So let's just say that whatever people speak here is sure as hell ain't Spanish. Do any of you have someone who you'll never forget, even though you never really knew them that well? Someone who was a constant in your life, just sort of a background character who isn't around anymore. Someone you find your mind drifting back to every now and then because even though you didn't know them that much, you just saw them all the time and they were like an interactive, friendly part of the furniture. Now, I don't mean that in a derogatory way. It's like a beloved lazy boy that you get from Goodwill. You don't know its backstory and you never will, and you don't ask about its past and it doesn't ask about yours. Christ, this sounds dehumanizing, but it's how I think about it. It's in a fond, loving way, trust me, and I hope one day I'm someone else's Goodwill lazy boy, someone who touched a person's life just by being there and someone they'll always remember. Now, I remember Mr. Browning. I'll never forget him, and even though the last time I saw him was probably 1985, I think I remember him fondly regardless of how things ended. Now, I sure know that I always thought fondly whenever this guy crossed my mind. Me and the wife often talked about how we should invite him over for dinner. We wondered if he was lonely after his wife had passed a decade or so before, and we wondered if his adult kids called often because they never seemed to visit. But we just never got around to asking Mr. Browning. Hell, I don't even remember what his Christian name was. It was always, "Good morning, Mr. Browning," and he'd respond with, "Good morning, Ted." He was my elder. We understood the hierarchy, and I do know that he was a former teacher, so maybe he thought of himself as Mr. Browning. Maybe it didn't even cross his mind to ask me to call him by his first name. Amos, that was it. Amos Browning, and I remember from his obituary and later the funeral. And I think those were the only times that I heard his first name spoken, and one of the only times that I saw his adult children. His son was a very doughy-faced man who looked bored to be at his father's funeral. His daughter was one of those sharp-faced women with a meek, sycophantic husband and the kind of bratty son who wanted to be the center of attention, even at Grandpa's wake. We didn't stay long. We'd gone to pay our tributes to Mr. Browning, but we couldn't stay. We didn't want his family asking us questions about his death, and they likely knew that I'd been present when it happened, and I'm not a good liar. I would have struggled to give them the answers they wanted instead of the horrible, haunting, traumatizing truth. Me and Mr. Browning used to chat over the fence. Well, I'd lean over the fence and he'd mow the lawn, and he was always mowing his lawn. He had one of those old push mowers, an electric one, and I just kept trying to persuade him to buy a ride-on, but he said his yard was way too small for that. It wasn't, and besides, at his age, probably early 70s, it was a great way to get some exercise and a little peace and quiet. Peace and quiet from who, I'm not really sure, since he lived alone after his wife had passed before me and my family moved in, but that's what he said. We'd talk a lot, but never really get to know each other, you know? We talked about the Detroit Lions a bunch. He was a die-hard supporter, and I was just a pretty casual one. And we talked about the weather, we talked about politics, but never too seriously. And sometimes we'd watch the same shows at the same time, and we'd talk about those too. We both loved Miles Davis and The Who and Kiss, and he told me about his first ever concert, sneaking in to watch Kiss play, but I was never sure if he was telling the truth or just recounting the plot of that one movie where that exact thing happens. It was a fun story anyhow, even if he told me about 5 times, and occasionally he'd ask about my wife and how she was doing and how her job was going, but I think he wanted to talk about his wife in exchange but couldn't bring himself to do so, apart from that one time. Sometimes my wife would bring him a lasagna or some other baked goods, and he'd thank her like a perfect gentleman, and he always handed the dishes back to me over the fence, never once brought them to our door, always over the fence. Now, I chatted to him so much that by the time we moved out, there was a groove in the ground where grass had stopped growing in the place where I'd always stood to talk to Mr. Browning. Now, I remember exactly what we were talking about on the day it happened. My wife had just had a minor operation to remove a benign cyst from her breast, and he was asking how she was doing. I told him she was doing fine and would be home from the hospital the next day or even that evening if things went well. Mr. Browning looked at me then as he was mowing the lawn and then told me that I was lucky and I should hold on to a good woman like that. And then he said, and I'll never forget it, not least because they were his last words, he said, "I miss her so much." And then he sort of looked down, away like he was about to hide tears, but I saw a look of alarm and then fear cross his face. Maybe I'm just imagining, but I swear that I saw him try and stop the forward motion of the mower as he pushed forward. I'm not sure how it happened. He was always so careful, running the electrical extension cable around the edge of the lawn, making sure that he was mowing nowhere near it, being careful like it was muscle memory. But I heard the crunch and whir of the motor running over the electrical socket and the cable, and I don't know how or why, but there was no grounding. The mower's rubber handles just sort of weren't there anymore, and the live electrical cables got tangled into the motor blades, mangling and electrifying the mower as Mr. Browning held onto it. And hold onto it he did. I watched in abject frozen horror as his body began to convulse, as smoke rose up from his hands where he was gripping the metal handle. I could smell the cooking flesh and electrical burn. I watched as the grass around him singed and blackened, and I knew I had to knock him away from the mower but couldn't touch him myself. I searched for something, anything that I could safely use to shove him off the mower. My eyes settled on my old wooden baseball bat, but by the time I'd hauled myself over that fence, I knew it was too late. Mr. Browning had collapsed to the ground, finally letting go of the lawnmower, and I knew that there was no saving him, so I ran over to the outlet and switched off the electricity. Then I went back over to my neighbor, my friend who I knew so little about, and he was blackened and charred. His face was horrific. His eyeballs had somehow survived the electrocution, and they stared white and frozen out of a face that looked like it had been sucked clean from the inside. One detail I remember, one grim detail, is how his mouth was open and how I realized that he had false teeth because they had fallen down into his throat. I ran into his house and called 911, and the rest was a blur of paramedics and police and being questioned. And at first, when his daughter got there, she seemed to somehow blame me for her father's death, as if she'd ever given a crap about him in life. He may not have opened up to me, but Mr. Browning certainly made it clear that his kids did not play a big part in his life. And so fast forward to the funeral, the son gave a eulogy, and it was like he barely knew his father any better than I did. It made me so sad and devastated that this man who seemed like nothing but a nice, amicable gentleman could have been so forgotten and discarded, except for the neighbor who gave him some friendly, superficial banter over the fence. The same neighbor who was forced to watch him die. I swore then that when I had a kid, I would do everything I could to make sure that they wanted me in their life forever. And as it turned out, my wife was unknowingly pregnant at the time of that funeral. We had a son and then later 2 daughters, and they were the loves of my life. They're all grown themselves now with families of their own, and my wife and I are grandparents, and we make sure to keep our family close. Regular meals together, Christmas and Thanksgiving being particularly huge affairs. Now, maybe Mr. Browning hadn't been a great father. It's not for me to judge his kids for distancing themselves from him. I don't judge them for their relationship with their father. It just sort of makes me sad. But before the sadness came the trauma. We bought our home with the intention of starting a family there, but every time I so much as stepped foot in the backyard, I was met with flashbacks of Mr. Browning cooking alive. I could smell that electric burn and see those bulging dead eyes. We made a loss selling, but we moved, and my son was born in a smaller house, but it was one filled with love and closeness, and I was no longer haunted by the sight of my neighbor's final moments, at least not directly. Like I said, I'll always remember Mr. Browning, and part of that means being cursed with remembering how I played witness to his demise. I've been a home renovations contractor here in the great state of Texas for coming up on 35 years now. And in that time, I've worked on some incredible homes and met some incredible people too. But I've also worked 1 or 2 jobs that have come to haunt me, and this is the story of one such job. In March of 1994, I got a call from a guy who just purchased a falling down home near Laredo Ranchettes, about 6 miles outside of Laredo. He said I'd need to stabilize the foundations, shore up the framing, and swap out any rotting beams or walls to align with state building codes. The roof needed reshingling, all the doors and windows would need resealing, and the whole place needed a massive utilities overhaul, including an HVAC replacement. Inside, I'd need to insulate the walls and attic, refinish the wooden floors, make sure all the bathroom fixtures were in good working order, and all after securing the right permits from the county courthouse. And all in all, it was looking like a 3 to 6 month job that had set the owner back between $50,000 and $100,000 or possibly more. And so as you can imagine, I accepted the contract pretty much there and then and signed it after 2 quick read-throughs to make sure everything was up to code. Now, I drove out to the place on a Monday morning, having signed the contract and received the keys on the Friday before. It was a big job, so I was pretty excited to get started, but when I arrived, I found out that my key didn't work. Now, I think I just rolled my eyes, then took out my phone to give him a call, but since it was pretty early in the morning, I was neither surprised nor annoyed when he didn't answer. I left a message on his voicemail asking him to call me back because he'd given me the wrong key. I wasn't rude about it, I just said it like it was, and how I'd appreciate if he could get me the real key as soon as humanly possible. Now, being there wasn't a complete waste of time because I could still survey the building's exterior and get a real feel for what I was dealing with. So for about the next half hour or so, that's what I did. right up until a black SUV came tearing up the road behind me and a guy dressed in a security uniform got out of it. He asked if I had permission to be on the land, so I explained who I was and why I was there. Now, once I explained I was the contractor, he softened up a little, but went on to explain how I couldn't be there just yet because the safety inspectors hadn't been around yet. Now, I thought I was doing the safety evaluation, but he went back to his truck to grab the paperwork for me. And then, since it all looked legitimate, with the name of the owner on there and everything, I got back in my truck and drove back into town. Now, I was having lunch by the time the client called me back, and while I figured it'd be a simple case of getting me the right key, it was anything but. He sounded annoyed when I picked up the phone and insisted that he had indeed given me the correct key. Now, I very calmly assured him that wasn't the case, but it was easily rectified, especially since he had a whole week before the safety inspectors could finish their work. Now, the client immediately says, "What safety inspectors?" And so I explained the whole encounter with a security guard that he hired. And once again, the client immediately responded with, "What security guard?" And this was when I realized something weird was going on. I told the client as much and how from experience there was probably some kind of illegal activity occurring in his vacant property. He sighed, then asked if I could meet him out at the house the following morning with a locksmith and a sheriff's deputy. The next morning, I did the same thing as the first and arrived at the vacant house around 8 a.m. And then over the next 10 to 20 minutes, the client, the locksmith, and the deputy rolled up one by one. The client goes over the situation with the deputy and the locksmith, just making sure that they're up to speed about what he might be facing inside. Then, once that was all out of the way, the locksmith got the door open and the deputy let us inside. And the first thing that struck me was how clean the place was. It was still run down and I could see a bunch of junk and old dusty furniture in one of the rooms, but the hallway looked like it had been swept meticulously, as did one of 4 rooms on the ground floor. But when the deputy walked into that room, he saw something that had him calling it in on his radio just a few seconds later. It was a chair, a metal one, and it looked like it had been bolted to the floor. It wasn't alone either. There was a bunch of chains piled up in one corner, and the deputy mentioned that too when he made his dispatch call. It was obvious that something bad had been happening there. Something really bad by the looks of things. We just didn't understand the extent of it, not until we got upstairs and saw what had been done to the shower cubicle. Now, the bathtub was in one corner, and the shower was in the other, and much like the hallway in the room downstairs, it looked like someone had taken a great amount of care in cleaning the place down. But that's not what stopped me in my tracks. What had my mouth open in shock and horror was the fact that someone had reinforced the shower cubicle with concrete slabs, and these concrete slabs looked like they had bullet holes in them. Not all the way through bullet holes, but almost like damage where bullets had hit the concrete. And as soon as he saw that, the deputy told us that we better go back outside because the place was almost certainly now some kind of crime scene. We just did as he asked and walked back outside in silence, and with this chill in the air despite that Texas heat. We knew we'd just been someplace where folks had been hurt and then killed, and there was no telling just how many folks that had happened to either. And it all made sense why the place was so clean too, at least the rooms people were using for their business there, and why they'd most likely been scrubbed down during the previous 24 hours following my first visit to the place. Now there was a real sense of they were just here, which only added to how damned creepy it all was. And I'll never forget the look on that deputy's face either, like he'd never seen anything like that before. The poor guy figured he was going to chase out some squatters and ended up walking around a freaking torture and execution chamber. And as you can probably guess, renovations were delayed until the cops could comb the house over for any evidence. But they didn't find a lick of it inside those 4 walls, and they didn't find anything around the property either, especially digging the place up so much that it looked like the surface of the moon. Just craters everywhere. I obviously wasn't told crap by the cops, I was just the contractor, but when it came time for the job to start back up again, the client filled me in on what they told him. And like I said, the cops didn't find anything. But based on how clean the place was in relation to how run down the home was, it was likely the house had been occupied during my first visit. And when I tried to unlock the door, there had been torturers and murderers inside, and maybe even victims too. And that gave me a whole second helping of all that creepy, they were just here feeling. Only as you can imagine, it was way worse that time, thinking that I'd been so close to such terrible evil, and it had been quietly lurking inside, while I'd been completely none the wiser. Evening, let's read. I'm a normal, regular-ass guy with a wife and kid. I lead a quiet life, I work in a bank, and I'm the last person to get involved in drama or scary situations or anything that you might want to hear about on your channel. At least, that's how I've always wanted to live my life anyway. Sometimes you don't have a choice, and that lack of choice doesn't come from your own actions, but from those around you. In my case, it was a house. And even before all of this happened, we used to call it the Nightmare House. We, being me and the other neighbors who were mostly friends, we do safari suppers, quiz nights at the local bar, all sorts of stuff like that. And apart from a handful of residents who had good reason, everyone got involved, and it was a nice, friendly community. And then there was the house next door to mine. The owner never joined us for events or hung out, and he never attended street parties or barbecues or singing carols during Christmas. Not because he was antisocial, but because we'd never once even met him. He'd never lived in the house, not since any of us could remember. Old Mr. Peterson said he could vaguely remember the owner from when he'd first bought the property a few decades back, but since then, nothing. And for whatever reason, this guy had bought the house and then just screwed off to South Africa or some such place and just left the property to gradually fall into ruin. And there must have been a caretaker at some point, because ever since any of us could remember, all the windows were boarded up and the doors were sealed with planks, but beyond that, it was clear that nobody cared for the property. The yards front and back were both overgrown and almost jungle-like, and the neighbors sometimes considered trying to maintain the outside a little, but good God. We all had our own lives and properties, and it wasn't like we were some uptight homeowners association. It was just kind of annoying to have this eyesore right in the middle of our normal suburban neighborhood. We kind of joked around about the owner, like he was a vampire who lived in the basement and the abandonment was some ruse or gallows humor and he died years ago and nobody noticed. And this joke kind of weighed on us, and one of the neighbors contacted the district for, I don't know, some kind of international wellness check. Now, we were assured that the owner was perfectly fine and living abroad and had every right to leave his property the way it was, as long as it wasn't in danger of collapsing or causing a safety hazard. And then the graffiti started, and we knew that it was a few of the neighborhood kids letting off some steam, including, I suspected, my own 15-year-old son, and so none of us really did anything about it. But slowly and surely, the building started to get tagged, scribbled at first, and then some genuinely kind of impressive artwork. And it was better than the squat brick monstrosity with the boarded-up windows, I guess. One piece was a parody of that British artist Banksy, and I am absolutely certain that one was my son because he'd conveniently been asking me about Banksy a few weeks before the art appeared. And so yeah, we called it the Nightmare House, but it was all in good fun. And if the owner cared about the graffiti or the yard turning into the Amazon, then he certainly never let that on. And for all I know, there was nobody in the vicinity who was even in touch with him, and he simply didn't know or care. Why he bought the house and left it to rot was anyone's guess. I know the answer now, but that can wait until the end of the story. We first noticed that something was up with the Nightmare House when one day, the boards over the front door disappeared. That was all. Nothing more, just that. Murmurs spread through the neighborhood. Had the owner finally returned after his decades-long estrangement from his poop hole of a house? Had he employed a caretaker? Had he sold the property? Sadly, none of the answers were this positive, as we'd soon learn. Squatters had moved in. And looking back, it's wild that this hadn't happened before now. The place was rife for squatting, and yet it had remained untouched. Not anymore, though. A few of us kept watch. Yeah, I know this makes us sound like curtain-twitching Karens, but some of us had young kids and we wanted to know what kind of squatters we were dealing with here. And we counted 4 regulars who clearly lived there and a bunch of others who came and went. And it was pretty obvious from the get-go that these weren't student squatters or struggling homeless people who just wanted a warm place for the night. One of the guys, the leader I would call them, was bald and covered in tattoos. He had about 5 visible teeth, and when he was shirtless, which was often, you could see vicious purple track marks running up and down his forearms. And he wasn't the kind of addict that you could feel sorry for, though. This guy was nasty. If he saw one of us even glancing in his direction, he'd hiss and let loose a torrent of abuse. He really wanted to establish the fact that this was his neighborhood now, and none of us better F with him. The other squatters called him Crunk. What a name, though. And then there was Blippo and F-Jockey. Not exactly how that name went. Then there was Blippo and F-Jockey. Not exactly sure how that name went. And they were almost as bad as him. F-Jockey was missing a leg just below the knee, and sometimes he'd hobble around on a rusty prosthetic, and other times he'd traverse the broken pathways of the nightmare house in a cranky old wheelchair, and I'm amazed that thing even really moved. And finally there was Finlay, who was the least worst of the 4. He'd at least occasionally offer mumbled apologies to the neighbors, while sort of skulking around wearing the same gray hoodie that he always wore. And he also clearly never washed it because you could smell him coming a mile off or smell where he'd been. And this is why I say that he was the least worst rather than a good guy, because when the thefts started, the crime scenes often reeked of Finlay, and he was the smallest and thinnest of the squatters, and we were certain that he was the one sneaking into neighbors' houses and stealing food and essentials. Never anything valuable, nothing that could cause too much of a rage, but someone was stealing our bread and our Twinkies, our detergent, that kind of stuff. And of course, he somehow managed to slip in and out unnoticed without violently breaking and entering. And so whenever we reported these thefts to the cops, it sounded kind of pathetic. "Oh, hey, officer, yeah, someone stole a bunch of bananas from the counter," or "Excuse me, detective, but our mop's gone missing and I can smell the aftermath of some homeless man." What we did try doing was reporting the squatters to the authorities, but apparently there are laws and protections for squatters, particularly ones that require the property's owner to make the report themselves. The cops told us that the owner wouldn't even respond to them about it, and he was almost impossible to track down in whichever foreign country he lived in anyway, so for all they could prove, the squatters were legitimate tenants. They weren't, of course, you could just tell, but without the owner actually confirming this or filing any kind of charges, they were free to come and go in their adopted home as they pleased. And they would do all sorts of stupid and creepy crap that gradually wore us down. My family, me, my wife, and my 2 kids were their direct neighbors, so we got the brunt of the hassle. And it started with dumb stuff, like connecting my garden hose to an outdoor faucet, and then swiping the hose and using it to fill their outdoor pool. And this was during a time when using hoses was banned, so I only found out about this when I received a letter warning me about my property's water usage. And even though I couldn't prove for sure that it was the squatters, but the hose had been left right by the fence and they mysteriously had a full pool in their back garden. Not an actual one or anything, it was like a large kiddie pool, but still. Now one time I did catch them. They'd connected an extension cord to our outdoor electricity outlet and snaked it over the fence to plug in what appeared to be an in-progress stereo stack system like you'd find in the 80s. And it seemed like they were building some kind of outdoor sound system under a makeshift gazebo they'd erected. And in retrospect, I should have been more alarmed by what this implied, but I was too mad about the electrical theft. I just unplugged the extension cord, and despite my wife pleading for me to just let it go, I stormed next door. F-Jockey answered the door, laying it on heavy about how hard it had been for him to answer the door trying to play the victim, but I was having none of it. I demanded to speak to Crunk. F-Jockey told me to wait and then shut the door in my face. Now I could hear him yelling for Crunk inside and then heard Crunk's response, and he sounded pretty heavily high on whatever. And when he eventually came to the door, his eyes were bloodshot and he still had a rubber strap tied around his upper arm. To his credit, it was the first time that he'd ever been polite and amicable. He apologized very sincerely for stealing my electricity, but told me that he thought that I wouldn't mind because I seemed like such a nice, generous guy who clearly cared for his neighbors. And then he started going on about how we were all children of Gaia and how electricity was a tool of the man, and if we didn't share it and spread it around, then we were just doing what they wanted. It was nonsense, but the way he spoke and the cadence of his voice, there was something hypnotic about it. I somehow found myself agreeing to let him use my outdoor outlet, and as I walked away, I kind of realized how Charles Manson managed to get so many followers. Some people just have something about them, no matter how obnoxious and vile they seem to be, and Crunk was clearly one of these people. The more I thought about it, the more dangerous I realized he could potentially be. I knew that we either had to drive those squatters out or somehow integrate them into the community. At our next hangout with the neighborhood guys, we decided that we'd try the latter. We'd invite them to our next cookout and try and make them feel welcome. Maybe they could help. And I was the one hosting the neighborhood cookout, so they could just hop the fence and join us for burgers and beers. I didn't have the opportunity to invite them to the cookout, though, as the next day, I went to get the barbecue grill set up for the summer and give it the usual routine maintenance and a good clean. And to my surprise, the space it usually occupied on my back porch was just empty. It wasn't a tiny barbecue grill either. It was a good 4 feet wide, a decently expensive piece of kit. How they got it over the fence and into the Nightmare House's yard is beyond me even now. But steal it they did, which I confirmed by glancing over the fence and saw Crunk and the boys grilling burgers on my grill, which they hadn't cleaned, so it was giving off a bit of a stench. When Crunk saw me looking, he waved and gave me a whole, "Hey neighbor, want to come over for some patties?" Now I kind of just let out that it was my grill, and Crunk sort of beamed this wide, toothless smile and said, yeah, he knew. He thought he'd give it a trial run for me before barbecue season started actually. And that was, of course, that they'd clean it all up and return it unharmed when they were done with it. I just felt helpless. What the hell was I supposed to say? I felt positioned on a knife's edge, like everything was just about balanced right now, but a single nudge in my entire life would collapse straight into the blade. I don't know if I'm expressing just how intimidating it all was, but ever since they moved in, it was just these looks, these sneers, these snatches of overheard conversation that I couldn't prove were about me and the neighbors, but were definitely talking about how they'd mess things up for anyone who gave them a hassle. And Crunk had these eyes that had a sort of dead glint to them. Crazy eyes, just like Manson or any of those cult leader guys. Now maybe I'm just a pussy, but I genuinely felt like if I dared to fight back in any way, something terrible would befall me and my family. My cowardice changed that weekend, though. I've been working late into the night, so I didn't get up until just past midday, and my wife was out at her job. My son was camping with some buddies, so I called for my daughter to say hi, but she was nowhere to be found. I brewed my morning, now afternoon coffee and stepped into the yard for a little cigarette. I know, smoking will kill you. Don't start it, kids. Anyways, I could smell cooking meat and the pungent smell of my uncleaned grill, and I could hear music playing on the stereo system that the squatters had set up using my electricity. And I could hear voices. Crunk, F-Jockey, Blippo, Finlay, a couple of unfamiliar male voices, a few female voices, and then a very familiar voice sounding kind of unsure and nervous. It was my daughter. My now 16-year-old daughter somehow next door with these filthy squatters. And feeling like a kind of weirdo but not wanting to look like one, I looked over the fence. And there she was, in that weird kiddie pool that they'd filled using my hose. She was wearing a bikini, one that I'd had no idea she even owned because if I had, I would have had severe words for her about wearing it out, considering it barely covered anything and she was 16 for Christ's sakes. And there she was, in that pool with Crunk, who I could unfortunately see was completely naked, sidling up to my daughter and trying to persuade her to free herself and lose those clothes like the rest of them. And that's when I noticed the other 3 naked girls lounging around that yard. They looked older than my daughter, but only just, and there were a couple of guys, and F-Jockey and Blippo, all completely nude, sprawled out around the garden, eating these greasy burgers and smoking what I definitely could smell was pot. And how the hell they talked my daughter into going over there in just that scrap of a bikini, I'll never know. Following the event, she didn't want to talk about it, and I could tell that she was ashamed and scared, so I never really pushed her on it. All I know is that she implied that Crunk was incredibly persuasive, in exactly the way that I'd considered when I compared him to Charles Manson. A red mist overtook me. I grabbed the first weapon I had, a shovel, and managed to pull myself over the 6-foot-high fence and leap into the squatter's garden. With a blow that impressed even myself, I punctured that kiddie pool with a shovel and then pressed it up against Crunk's throat before anyone had a chance to react. I saw Blippo, the biggest of the guys, start to stand up, and I told him that if he moved a muscle, his buddy would be missing a head. And all the while, I noticed Finlay standing in the corner of the yard kind of shaking, looking like he was going through H withdrawals. Jesus Christ, what a life these people led. And Crunk raised his hands and started on about how I was freaking out over nothing, that I was being a controlling father, that my daughter was an adult in her own person and could do what she wanted. Now at this point I was shaking with rage and struggling not to deprive my kids of a father by committing first-degree murder. I told Crunk through these gritted teeth that my daughter was in fact not an adult and was a 16-year-old child. Meanwhile, my daughter was crying and begging me to forgive her, saying that she was sorry, begging me not to think less of her, things like that. It broke my heart, and I told her that I didn't judge her at all, but I couldn't look at her in the moment. Not that I wouldn't, but I was just too hesitant to take my eyes off of Crunk. I told my daughter to get out of the now deflated kiddie pool, grab a towel, and head back to our house now. Crunk had the absolute gall to moan that it was his towel and we couldn't steal it, and I responded by pressing the shovel, brand new and unblunted by lack of use, right against his stupid throat. And I think he knew I was serious. And then when I was sure that my daughter had left the backyard, I said, "I'm gonna go now." And I slowly backed away. As I was leaving, I left them with one final warning. I suggested that they find a new place to squat because my patience was at an end and I wouldn't be so forgiving next time. I said a bunch of other stuff too, like if they ever came near my daughter again, it would be the end of them, and that they were no longer going to steal my crap, that kind of thing. And I swear to God, Crunk just smiled at me and said, "May the Lord bless and watch over you." And I remember shivering as I left their back gate and followed my daughter back to our house. For some reason, I didn't think that the Lord which Crunk referred to was the same Lord I worshipped in church most Sundays. And the squatters didn't move out. We had a neighborhood meeting in which we discussed potential ideas of getting rid of them. None of them were any good. They either involved violence or had no chance of working. And we all left feeling very dejected. But then a mysterious stranger solved the problem for us. One evening, all the squatters were out doing God knows what people like that do, and, at least from what I overheard them suspecting, a drug dealer they'd pissed off sent his goons around and firebombed that house with a couple of Molotov cocktails, or something. And the goons somehow got in through the backyard, hurled those cocktails through the back windows, which the squatters had removed the boards from sometime previously. By the time the fire department put the blaze out, the house was a charred husk. Nobody would be living there anytime soon, and no security camera captured footage of the culprits. No arrests were made, and no evidence was found. The squatters moved on, and the neighbors all celebrated their departure despite the scare of the fire. I celebrated too, but it was something that I kept to myself. I'd installed an outdoor security camera after the incident with my daughter, and it captured the neighboring property's yard, and I told the cops that I hadn't gotten around to setting it up yet, but that was a lie. You see, the camera didn't capture a bunch of drug dealer henchmen showing up to burn the place down. It captured a single figure, leaving my house in his beloved Nirvana hoodie, and it showed him vaulting over the fence and with shaking hands, throwing that Molotov into the property. And then it showed him climbing back over the fence and disappearing back into my house. My son and daughter are twins, and my son is incredibly protective over his sister, and we never spoke about the incident. After I viewed and deleted that footage, I spoke to my wife in front of my son and said that they are very lucky that the fire hadn't spread to our house, that the firebombers needed to be more responsible. Responsible, my wife asked and laughed. I just nodded and gave my son a look. One day, I'm going to have to talk with him. I'm going to have to tell him that he must never ever do anything as insane as that again, that violence isn't the answer, that no matter how sure he was that the squatters were all out, he couldn't be 100% sure. But not just yet. For now, I'm just still celebrating their departure and the return of the owner who, due to the structural damage, was able to have the property demolished. Now, for one final sting in the tail, the owner of the property joined us in the bar one night, and he apologized profusely for how things had played out. He explained that he grew up in that house as a foster child, and while he didn't go into detail, he told us that he suffered there, and he called it the Nightmare House, which caused us all to shoot each other a look. He explained that he'd grown up and put the past behind him and become a successful software engineer back when the internet was first taking off. And then, when he saw the house was up for sale in the market, he bought it with the intention of having it demolished then. But he was denied permission by the district for some reason or another, and instead he was left owning the property filled with this cancerous memory like an albatross around his neck. And so his way of getting revenge on the house was to let it rot, and again he apologized profusely for not considering the effect that would have on the rest of the neighborhood. But now, with the damage to the house, he'd finally been granted permission to have it knocked down and had decided that he was going to turn the land into a graffiti art area and a skate park, having seen photos of some of the graffiti before the squatters moved in. He ended the night by saying that he wished he could thank the arsonists and then looked around at all of us. Now, I'm sure he thought one of us had burned the place down, and honestly, even knowing a hint of the dark memories that place held for him, I'm not surprised that he was grateful that he could finally wake up from the nightmares of the Nightmare House. As for what became of those squatters, who knows? And frankly, after the crap they pulled, who cares? My name's Charlene, and I'm from Austin here in Texas, and I think I got a story that you might be interested in. It's one I've followed for the past 34 years now, and as of September of last year, it might finally have come to an end. But don't just take it from me. You can come to your own conclusions as I tell you from my own perspective about the yogurt shop murders. So in December of 1991, I was working at a store with a little strip mall in North Austin, and I had to open up the store on a Saturday morning. We were just down the strip from a branch of I Can't Believe It's Yogurt, a place that I used to stop by sometimes whenever the heat got a little too much. Now, mornings were usually nice and quiet, even on a Saturday, but on that morning, I noticed a whole bunch of police standing outside the yogurt shop. I knew not to be nosy, but I couldn't help but ask if everything was all right, as smoky black stains suggested some kind of fire. One officer told me it was fine and that I should just go about my business. Now, he said it in a friendly voice, but a smile didn't quite reach his eyes. The police were still standing outside the yogurt shop when I clocked out and began making my way home. Only that time, there were men in shirts and ties standing with them, talking and taking notes. I caught a ride home with a friend, got to work on making dinner, and then later on while watching the evening news, I got a new report on what had happened at the yogurt shop, and I don't think that I'd ever been so horrified in my entire life. The newsreader described how, just the previous night, a fire had been reported at the yogurt shop. That didn't really come as a surprise, as I'd already seen the scorch marks and the soot. But the newsreader went on to say that after putting the fire out, firefighters were horrified to discover the naked, lifeless bodies of 4 young women. On the shop floor, a 15-year-old girl named Sarah Harbison lay dead on the tiles. Her body was joined by those of 17-year-old Eliza Thomas and Sarah's 17-year-old sister, Jennifer Harbison. All 3 had been shot in the head after being stripped and gagged with their own underwear. And then, thanks to the fire that had no doubt been started by their killer, each of the girls had extensive burns all over their bodies. In the back of the store, police found the body of a 13-year-old girl named Amy Ayers. Her burns weren't as bad as the other girls, but she'd been shot, execution style, same as the other girls. And the whole of Austin was shocked to its core by what had happened, and there were all kinds of tributes and vigils and whatnot so people could mourn the girls' passing and console their families. But once all that sadness was gone, once all the tears had been cried, it was replaced by this sense of anger and fury toward whoever had taken the girls' lives. It was so bad that a couple of days later, when some teenager was found carrying the same kind of gun as was used in the murders, everyone was convinced the cops had found the guilty party. I think 100 years prior, and they'd have broken into the county jail and lynched that poor kid. And I say poor kid because he was innocent of the murders and tried lying his way out of trouble because he was scared to catch a gun charge. But then once the police rolled him out as a suspect, there was this shared sense of frustration, like it was back to the drawing board, as it were. And we all hoped a new suspect would be found, and soon, but we had to wait years for any developments to this investigation, and when they arrived, it made no sense at all. When a new detective took over the case, he decided that the most likely suspects were actually the poor teenager I mentioned, along with 3 of his friends. You see, when they were first picked up, the cops were so convinced of their innocence that no record was made of what was said during their interviews. But that meant that this new lead detective wanted to interview them all over again. And the entirety of Austin was confused as hell because if these kids, who were by then in their 20s, had already been cleared, then why the heck were they being interviewed all over again? Now, we thought that it was some big waste of time and that the real killer was still out there. So imagine our shock when 2 of the boys, Rob Springsteen and Mike Scott, confessed to the murders during the second round of interviews. They went to trial and were convicted of capital murder, and both ended up receiving life in prison. We thought that was the end to the story, that those poor girls' killers had been found and that they were where they belonged. But then in 2008, we got another shocker when the Court of Appeals overturned both boys' convictions on account of improper procedure. It was a shocker, all right, but we still felt trapped in that same terrible spiral, if that makes sense, because the state announced that they were seeking a retrial. I felt like tearing my damned hair out when I heard the news, but then came the DNA announcement. Because after all the analysis of all the samples, there was no evidence whatsoever that any of the 4 boys had anything to do with the yogurt shop murders. And after that, it was that same back to square one feeling, but it was much less hopeful. Almost 20 years had come and gone. The trails had no doubt gone cold, and many of my friends and neighbors were resigned to the fact that the killer would never be caught. And maybe about a year later, one of the original suspects ended up getting shot to death by police after a traffic stop went horribly wrong. Maurice Pierce, who didn't go to trial and wasn't sent to prison, ended up stabbing a police officer in the neck during a traffic stop. Another shocker, only a really nasty one that time. The officer almost died, and it got us all wondering if there had been some kind of mistake with the DNA testing. I mean, the guy tried to murder a cop by stabbing him in the neck, so even if he wasn't proven guilty, he sure as hell didn't seem innocent, you know? Now, we had to wait another 11 years for another development, by which time we'd next to given up on the yogurt shop killer ever being caught. And it made me sick to think that he was out there, walking free after doing such a terrible, evil thing. But then, in December of 2021, we got one heck of an early Christmas present when the yogurt shop case was once again reopened. Advanced DNA techniques were going to be used, meaning that even though so much time had passed, we were closer than ever to finding out who did it. Because as I might have said, the cops had a DNA sample from someone they believed was the killer, and it was simply a case of finding a match. Now, even more resources were dedicated to the case in 2022 and 2023, which had us all praying that the murders would be solved once and for all. And then finally, in September of last year, so 2025, Austin police announced that they'd solved the case. After running DNA samples alongside the one from the yogurt shop, they realized that it was a near-perfect match for a man named Robert Brashers. Brashers was a serial killer who had been previously linked to the yogurt shop murders by DNA, and as early as 2018 if memory serves. But without the proper technology, police couldn't put it beyond reasonable doubt until just months ago. It was nice to finally know who was responsible, but it hurt knowing justice would never be truly served, as Brashers took his own life during a shootout with police in 1999. After getting the DNA results, police managed to get a hold of the gun that he used during that shootout. They test-fired it and then compared the bullet casing to one found at the yogurt shop crime scene, and it was an exact match. The news marked the end of a long, painful, and frightening story in the history of this town, one we could finally put to bed. But for some of us, who've been forever affected by what happened to those poor teenage girls. It's not over. And I recently read that under Texas law, if someone is imprisoned and later the conviction not only gets overturned, but the person is also declared innocent, they get up to $80,000 for each year they were wrongfully imprisoned. The article I read had a quote from lawyers of Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott. They said that they were hopeful that they'd receive the proper amount in restitution. But for me, it's that hope. That's all we can ever really hold on to. So recently, I moved into an apartment block in a pretty artsy area of a pretty artsy neighborhood. Now, I won't dox myself, but you can probably guess one of two places I mean, and it's not the New York one. I love this apartment building. It was more of a boarding house, really. Only 8 apartments and the top floor belonging to the building super. And all the neighbors were really friendly, and most of us were artists of some sort. And there was me, a painter, and then we had a singer, a couple of writers, 2 more painters, and a mixed media artist, and apparently a sculptor. The sculptor was the neighbor directly across from me. Nobody knew his name, or even if he definitely was a he. He just went by the moniker TTT, all capital. The rest of us would often have sort of group brainstorm evenings where we'd chat about art and set the world to rights, in the common room or TV room that we all shared on the ground floor. Triple T never joined us, of course, and soon the mysterious sculptor became the subject of fascination for a group of creatives with hefty imaginations and too much time on our hands, obviously. Nearly all of the theories about TTT's true identity were ridiculous. Most of them were supernatural, and one of the painters absolutely swore that Triple T was Shia LaBeouf and claimed that she'd seen him when he moved in. And when we showed her a photo of Shia LaBeouf, though, she said it was the other Shia LaBeouf, and we could never quite work out what she actually meant by that. One of the writers decided that Triple T was a ghost, like in the movie Ghost, and that his sculptures were all clay pots, and he was waiting for his Demi Moore to sit at the pottery wheel so he could finally create again. The singer claimed that Triple T was a beautiful woman whose face had been disfigured in a terrible car accident, which explained why some of her sculptures displayed in local galleries showed various figures in states of damage. Me, I just thought that Triple T was a reclusive sculptor who valued their privacy, and whenever TTT had a new sculpture to display, it would be found standing outside their apartment, and men in some suits from a certain gallery would come to collect it. Triple T always displayed at the same gallery, which I can't name for the same reason as not wanting to reveal myself. I did try knocking on Triple T's door a few times. Once or twice, I heard signs of life, and one time I was absolutely certain that I was being watched through a peephole. Just a gut feeling, but it did make me shiver. But if Triple T wasn't answering, I wasn't going to keep prying in there. And that's why it shocked me when, one Friday evening, I stepped out of my apartment ready to attend one of our weekly brainstorming sessions, only to see T's apartment door open a crack. Only darkness spilled from within, and I didn't want to enter without permission, so I just said, "Hello?" through the gap. No answer, although I was sure that I heard movement inside. The door was open. Someone could be in trouble, I thought. That was just sort of a justification enough to take a peek inside, right? And I turned on the flashlight app on my phone, but covered it with my palm just in case. And when I stepped inside, it was completely pitch black in there. I raised my phone, warning whoever was in there that I was about to light up the room, and then I slowly moved my hand away from the lens. I was not prepared for what I saw. The room was entirely bare. The walls and floor were sealed in plastic wrap. You know, the kind that they use in Dexter or some serial killer movies when they're about to kill someone in a room and don't want to leave blood splatter. And that wasn't the creepy part, though. The real creepy part was the statue that stood in the center of the room. It wasn't some kind of horror mannequin. It wasn't some horrific effigy of myself or anything else in the building. It was a classic-looking statue of the Holy Mother Mary, the kind that you find in a Catholic church. The only strange thing about her was that instead of a normal face, she'd been painted up to look like, of all things, a mime. I can't explain it, but I was absolutely certain that the statue was watching me. I was certain somehow that Triple T was the statue. The statue was Triple T. I took a tentative step forward and tapped the Mary statue. It was porcelain, and against my better judgment, I started to reach up and touch the face. It looked like flesh, and it looked so much like human flesh. My fingertips were less than an inch away, and I was about to touch it. I was about to touch TTT. And then I heard a noise in the room behind me. It was sort of like a muffled cry, like the word help. And I snatched my hand back from that statue and hurried to the door directly behind the statue. And it was the only door in the room. And before trying to open it, I called out hello again. No response. I grabbed the door handle and twisted it. The door was locked, but the moment I twisted the door open, I heard a loud, shattering crash behind me. Quickly whipping around, I saw the Mother Mary statue shattering and collapsing to the floor. I had no idea what to do. Had I just destroyed some priceless artifact? I walked up to that debris as carefully as I could, and the face was just laying there, and I'd been right. It was skin, sort of. It was a latex ball with Mary's face painted on it, and then a voice spoke from an unseen speaker somewhere in the room. I am TTT. This is art. You are the art. Please leave. And so I left. I left and ran down the stairs and cursed myself a million times for not filming what I'd just seen. I told everyone what had happened and we all rushed upstairs, but TTT's door was once again locked. And once again, I was certain that as we all stood there, someone was watching us through that peephole. And 2 days later, there was a small portable safe left outside of TTT's apartment, and the same guys in suits came to collect it. 2 days later after that, I received a gilded invitation in the mail to attend a private showing at Gallery Redacted before it opened to the public, and the invite was from Triple T themselves. Of course, I went hoping to meet the reclusive sculptor. No such luck. Triple T's agent was there and informed me that Triple T's final piece was being unveiled that night. Unlike all their other pieces, it was a video. It was a video showing me entering the apartment, a black bar across my face to protect my identity. It showed me from various camera angles, cameras that must have been hidden in the walls, in the ceiling. And then it showed me from the perspective of Mother Mary's eyes. And for a second, just a few frames, the sensor bar disappeared and my face was replaced by that of a skull. And then it showed me rushing for the door, and here, the camera split into two joint shots, one showing me turning the doorknob, the other showed the statue trembling and collapsing, clearly triggered by some kind of mechanism in the door. Then the rest mostly played out how I described it. Except as I picked up Mother Mary's head, again the sensor bar disappeared from my face and this time briefly showed an angel, like a Greek sculpture. And the final shot of the video was simply text saying, "Life is clay, and you are all my sculpture. Goodbye, TTT." That was the only time the video was shown. I've tried to track down a copy for this last year. If anyone out there has any leads at all, please let me know in the comments. But holy crap, this was the creepiest and most bizarre thing to happen to me, and I am obsessed with getting a copy of this video. If anyone has any leads, anyone at all, please comment. I need to see it again. I need to understand why Triple T was trying to say this and what it says about me. All the other artists in the boarding houses have theories, and I'll leave you to make up your own. But there's one thing I've learned from all of this, one universal truth that speaks to us all in our very soul. Artists are freaking weird, man. As a younger man, I was a Texas Ranger for the better part of 2 decades, and in that time, I saw and heard things that would quite literally haunt a man until he's lying in his grave. But out of all of those things, there's only one that haunts me more than most, and that creeps into my mind on those cold and lonely nights when I wonder if I ever really made a true difference. It was the early 80s, I was a much younger man, and I was essentially working as an understudy to a veteran ranger who had a heck of a lot of wisdom to impart to me. Then one day, we were asked to go visit a guy named Wolf, Paul Wolf, to ask him about his wife's ex-husband. A Mr. Billy Staton and his current partner had been missing for a few days, having apparently last been seen paying a visit to Mr. Wolf's house. Mr. Wolf was by that time married to Mr. Staton's ex-wife and had shared custody of Staton's daughter, Melody. He also didn't think her father treated her very well, most likely on account of his wife talking trash about him when he wasn't around. Wolf would sometimes become aggressive with Billy Staton whenever he showed up to pick up his daughter, sometimes very aggressive. And so Mr. Staton decided that he's going to slip a small tape recorder into his pocket prior to pickup so he can prove to a judge just how hostile Wolf really was. Now, when we arrived at Wolf's home, he claimed no knowledge of Staton's visit. He said Staton and his fiancée, a lady named Letitia Castro, hadn't been by in almost a week, and since they hadn't stopped by to exchange custody, they just kept hold of little Melanie until they decided to show. Now, we knew that wasn't the case, so we knew that we caught him in a lie, and that was all the grounds we needed to arrest him on suspicion of murder. And then, surprise, surprise, once he was in custody, Mr. Wolf changed his tune and admitted that Staton and Castro had stopped by his place. He started claiming that upon trying to remove his daughter from the property, Staton became forceful and started yelling at her. Wolf said he stepped in and tried to calm Staton down, but Staton began yelling and shoving him away. A fight broke out, but while Wolf was merely trying to restrain the angry Staton, Staton was straight up trying to murder him. Wolf said he tried, and he tried, yelling for his wife, Staton's ex, to call the cops, but Staton overpowered him and forced him to escalate. Wolf said that in order to save his own life, his wife's life, and the life of her daughter, he began striking Mr. Staton around the head with an iron bar. Now, he said he blacked out, like the red mist had descended on him, and then when he woke up, Mr. Staton and his fiancée were dead. Wolf said that in a panic, he threw the two bodies into the back of his truck and then drove out to a nearby river to dump them. He told us where the spot was, so we drove out to see if he was telling the truth. It turns out the bodies were exactly where he said they'd be, bloated and half rotten from laying there in lukewarm river water. But I guess Wolf was counting on the bodies being too rotten to really analyze, because when we found them, Miss Castro's corpse showed that she'd been shot in the head at close range and was something of a large caliber. Now, this directly contradicted Wolf's story, as he insisted only the metal bar was used to defend himself and his family. But that wasn't the only thing that proved Wolf was lying, because when we dragged Billy Staton's body out of the water, we found something hidden on his person. A small tape recorder with a tape still inside it. And since restoring that kind of tech was way beyond our capabilities, we sent the tape over to the FBI lab in Washington to see if they could pull anything off of it. The tape was actually moldy at the time, and you'd think that we'd have dried it out and cleaned it off before sending it, but according to the folks over at the lab, drying it out was the worst thing that we could do to it. And we ended up mailing it to them in a little plastic jar of water, and then a couple of weeks later, they mailed us back a fully working copy of the original. And the audio wasn't exactly crystal clear, but it was clear enough to make out individual voices, as well as what they were saying, and what they were saying contradicted Paul Wolf's entire story. Now, right away, we could tell his story had been a bold-faced lie, almost right from the jump. It's possible to hear Mr. Staton asking his daughter to come with him, at which point she began to cry. Now, we figured this lined up with what Wolf had said about Staton being such a poor father that his daughter dreaded being in his company. But as she cried, he wasn't angry or aggressive with her. He merely attempted to calm and console what sounded like a tired and cranky kid. Yet as Mr. Staton tried to calm his daughter, it was Wolf who became aggressive, and then after what sounded like a brief struggle, a series of very deep thumps can be heard. The next you hear is that Mrs. Wolf, Billy Staton's ex, who begins yelling, "Get him! Hurry up and get him!" Mrs. Wolf then yells, "Hit him again," and then the front door. And that last part was in reference to the fact that Miss Castro was trying to escape. Somebody ran to block the door, and then Miss Castro's life was ended too. Mrs. Wolf then begins yelling, "Get him up! Get him out of here!" At which point Mr. Wolf enlisted the help of one Glenn Henderson, who later confessed to his part in disposing of the bodies and was sentenced to life in prison. Sometime later, apparently during the cleanup process, Paul Wolf can be heard saying, "Damn it, Glenn, look at the mess you made." And we later found out that Mr. Henderson had failed to actually wrap one set of remains, and while lifting it up to carry it out of the house, a large amount of blood leaked onto the hallway carpet. And this ended up being a crucial piece of evidence even after the Wolves hired an industrial-grade vacuum cleaner to try and get rid of it. And we ended up putting both Paul Wolf and his wife away for a very long time. Now, during my time in the Rangers, I came to witness a lot of very disturbing crime scenes. But we get there when it's all over and the dust has settled. We occasionally watched pieces of security camera footage, and I understand that these days they come with sound and color. But back then, it was all black and white and grainy, and it ran like a silent movie. I realized that I'd seen a lot of dead people, and I'd seen quite a number receive fatal injuries. I just never heard anyone die before. So the sound Billy Staton made on the tell-all recording, that groan that he let out as his skull was being caved in, I think it might haunt me for the rest of my natural life. Long-time listener, first-time writers, they say, and this happened about a year ago, and holy F, I never thought something this messed up would happen to me and my family. So it all started when my parents, both recently retired, decided to use their part of their life savings to go away on a 6-month world cruise. Not really my jam, but they were psyched about it, and I was psyched for them. And even better, the lease on my apartment was up the week before they left, so I was free to house sit for them the entire time they were gone. This was a relief to my mom, who would have spent the whole cruise in a state of neurosis, calling me or my brother to check on the house every 5 minutes. And knowing that I was living there ironically meant that she wouldn't worry at all. Oh, Mother, if only you'd known. In the week before they left, as I moved my things into my old childhood bedroom ready for the next 6 months, my mom gave me the rundown of the house as if I hadn't grown up there. I barely paid attention to all the things that she was telling me. Yes, Mom, I know where the fridge is, I know the Wi-Fi password, I know how to use the TV, I know the guest room is filled with Aunt Joni's art while she's between husbands, and that I must not dispose of any of it. What I didn't know about, though, was the new neighbor. His name was Mr. Samuels, and he moved in a few months previously. If you believe my mom, Mr. Samuels was an angel sent from heaven. He was the loveliest, sweetest old person, Mom said, despite the fact that he was only a couple of years older than my dad. Now, he baked cakes for the neighbors, so I shouldn't be surprised if he dropped by with some muffins or maybe even some red velvet cake. I admit, I do like a good red velvet cake, so maybe Mr. Samuels was okay by me. Mr. Samuels had a nurse who came by every other day, so I didn't need to worry about him apparently, not that I'd been planning to. Mom did enough worrying for the whole family. I didn't actually see Mr. Samuels before my parents left for their cruise because he was away staying with one of his kids. And so I bid my parents farewell at the docks, waving a handkerchief and sobbing like a wartime bride. Not really, but then headed back to the house, ready for 6 months of hardcore freelance art commissions and watching all the subscription services that my parents subscribed to and I didn't want to pay for. Mr. Samuels returned home a few days into my newfound alone time. And imagine my absolute surprise when the gentle Mr. Rogers-esque fella that I pictured was absolutely nothing like that at all. Mr. Samuels may have been 75 years old, but he was the kind of 75 that looked ex-Navy SEAL, and in fact was, and who probably had a home gym, and he did, and he was a muscular, confidently spoken, weirdly charming man, and at first I wondered why he needed a regular nurse, and then when I first saw the nurse show up for his first appointment, I remember that my mother can be rather naive sometimes. Let's just say that she was the kind of nurse who is paid good money to relieve someone's tension via massage, and just leave it at that. But hey, the man was single, and just because he was old, it didn't mean that he didn't have needs. And every other day at 75? Damn, I was almost in awe. Now, he did bake a very good red velvet cake, and one of his first acts as a welcome gift was to bring a cake over and introduce himself. I'll admit, while he was charming, he also made my skin crawl. I'm a 32-year-old woman, and this 75-year-old man, who looked like he could easily overpower me without a moment's thought, was very clearly trying to rizz me up, as the kids say. And I usually hate the phrase undressing me with his eyes, but there was no better way to describe it here. And Mr. Samuels made no secret of it. He'd make remarks like, "Gladys never said her daughter was so cute," or how he'd wish that he'd known my mom when she was my age, things like that. It would have been flattering if it wasn't so intense and he wasn't quite so, I don't know how to describe it, but he had this aura where it was obvious that he wanted me to know that he could take me. And I've known guys like this since high school, but never once was he ever twice my age. And he wasn't so much a silver fox as a white wolf, and once I got that image in my head, I couldn't shake it. Thankfully, I didn't have many dealings with Mr. Samuels outside of him bringing over baked goods, and in the end, as much as it hurts me to have to do so, I ended up tossing them out because I was becoming paranoid that he might be slipping something into the baking. I'd watched an Instagram short about a predator who did some fairly gross stuff like that, and I got it inside my own head about it a little. Looking back, I am pretty grateful that I didn't risk it. And so after a month of catching up on art commissions and emailing editors begging for work, I began to go a little stir-crazy. Surprisingly, Mom didn't call anywhere near as much as I expected, and I found myself missing my goofy parents a lot. We had a few Zoom calls, but the internet on the cruise ship wasn't exactly reliable, and so half of the time, it was like watching my folks in stop motion while Mom yelled, "What was that? What did you say, Sel?" over and over, as my name is Celeste, but she calls me Sel. I decided to surprise my parents by giving the house a little bit of a decluttering, or at least the parts that I knew that I was allowed to touch. Aunt Joni's paintings could stay, but I knew that the attic was an absolute crap show of disorganization. Plus, I figured that I'd find a bunch of fun childhood memories up there, and maybe some stuff that was worth a bit of money. I remember my brother having a bunch of old consoles and action figures that surely had to be worth something, and God knows that we both could have used the money since we were both artists. I wasn't in the attic for long before I came to two realizations. One, this was going to be a mammoth job, and two, someone had cut a hole in the drywall between our attic and the adjoining one. And of course, it was Mr. Samuel's attic. Not only that, cables were snaking through the hole, followed them through the maze of boxes and old Christmas decorations, and I was horrified at what I found. Holes had been drilled into the floor, very recently by the look of the sawdust, and two wires snaked down into two rooms. Now, without going into technical details, I traced the wires to the bathroom and the bedroom that I was staying in and discovered that small cameras had been set up, hidden within fake smoke alarms. Now, following the wires back up and creeping into Mr. Samuel's attic, I found a laptop running with active feeds of both rooms. The bedroom camera was angled so you could see the whole room, and the bathroom camera was angled at the shower. And so in short, dear sweet old Mr. Samuels had literally been spying on me for God knows how long and had violated my privacy in the most diabolically disgusting way. I minimized the live feed and found a folder on the desktop marked quote-unquote best of. The contents horrified me. There were a number of videos of me showering, of me changing, and even a couple of where I was, for want of a better term, relieved some tension of being single in bed. Now, without thinking, in utter disgust, I deleted the entire folder and emptied the recycle bin, and then immediately realized the idiotic move I'd made. Subconsciously, though, I think my brain drove me to do so in order to avoid considering law enforcement, and more on that later. I wanted revenge on Samuels, but I also wanted him to live with fear of the revenge. Now, my first step was to sever the wires connecting the cameras. My second step was to head downstairs and reach out to a friend of mine who was, how do I put this, good with computers. He sent me a piece of software to install on Mr. Samuel's computer via a USB stick that would completely mess up not only his laptop, but any computer connected to the same router. Irreparably, my friend promised. Now, I should add here that I knew Samuels was out of town for a few days, supposedly visiting his daughters again. Now, who knows what he really got up to? It could have been literally anything. And he was due back the next day, so I hurried and installed the virus on his laptop via that USB stick. I followed my friend's instructions and then forced myself to leave the attic and wait a day or so for Mr. Samuels to return. And I could tell when he discovered the outcome of his deception. From his laptop speaker, a robotic voice began blaring, "I'm a voyeur pervert and I also have kids," over and over again. Above me, I could hear Samuels freaking out until he slammed that laptop shut. Then I heard his footsteps thundering down the stairs, presumably to his other main PC, and I waited and then, "I'm a voyeur pervert and I also F kids." According to my friend, there was absolutely no way to get rid of this unless you were a tech genius or whatever. Something about writing it to the root of the BIOS or something, so even a hard drive wipe and Windows reinstall wouldn't fix it. And something told me that while Mr. Samuels might be capable of setting up a pervert spy network, he wasn't capable of fixing this. I was right, because the next weekend, I saw his entire desktop PC smashed into little bits sitting out on the sidewalk for the garbage collection. Hilariously, they wouldn't take electronics, so it was just sort of left there until the HOA contacted him about the unsightly garbage, and the next day, a snapped laptop joined the pile. Now, I'm sure he suspected me because the baking delivery stopped, and he also avoided eye contact with me whenever we'd pass each other, coming and going. Now, I still felt sick that this dirty, disgusting old perv had gotten away with getting off to me at my most vulnerable, though. I kept consoling myself with the reminder that he was 75 and would be dead long before me. But then I had nightmares about how he might have sent the videos to other like-minded perverts. No matter how much I reminded myself that the low-quality, grainy pictures made my identity impossible to discern, it didn't help because Samuels could easily have doxed me. I live in fear of something else happening, but nothing else did. I confessed my fears to my friend, though, who suggested one final idea. I don't know exactly what he did, but a few days later, a smartphone arrived in the mail. My friend told me to stick it through Samuel's mailbox in the middle of the night and just leave it at that. And I asked him why and what the phone contained, but he told me it was better that I didn't know. I posted the phone. Whatever was on there had caused Samuels to become a recluse, and the rest of my house sitting went without incident. And after a while, I noticed that the nurse was no longer coming to visit Samuels. Good. And that man didn't deserve any joy in his life. And eventually, my parents returned from their cruise. I didn't tell them anything about what had happened. I was honestly just too ashamed, and too worried that my dad, the mild-mannered as he was usually, would spend his remaining years in prison for killing their next-door neighbor if he knew what he'd done to his baby girl. Now, a few months after I moved out into my own place again, Mom mentioned that Mr. Samuels had been placed into an assisted living facility by his children. She said it was all very strange, like he mentally declined within the space of a year. Now, I said nothing, but I had to suppress a smile there. I don't know if I did the right thing by not calling the cops and handling everything in this very unusual way, but here's the reason. When I was in college, I was assaulted. My experience with the police was, well, as I'm sure some of you know, not so good. And I was made to feel like it was all my fault because of how I dressed and because I'd had maybe 2 drinks, because I'd been affectionate with my assailant. I know all cops aren't like that. I know that plenty of cops are sympathetic, even heroic with certain victims, but I was not one of them. And the idea of trying to convince them that my elderly neighbor was spying on me, even though realistically the evidence was all there, it just terrified me. And so maybe I handled things pretty badly. Maybe me and my friend taking justice into our own hands was an immoral decision. But honestly, knowing what that man was capable of in his 70s, I can only imagine the things that he may have done when he was younger, fitter, and more savvy at getting away with it. And knowing he's spending the last years of his life slowly losing his mind in an assisted living facility, probably being spoon-fed baby food by a tattooed male orderly who he can't sexually harass, well, honestly, I sleep at night just fine. I do still periodically check for spy cams though, as I'm quite paranoid and you can never be too careful. So many years ago, my parents still lived in the house that I grew up in as a child. The neighbors, Mr. and Mrs. Morse, stuck out to me as a kid as a regimental, stern couple. Now, Mr. Morris was the type of man you can only describe as blustering, and Mrs. Morris was sort of like a human square, with a bowl haircut and a mustache almost as bushy as her husband. Now, if this sounds like being uncharitable to them, hell yeah, I definitely am, and you'll hate these two by the end of the story as well. Unless you're a psychopath, in which case, may I suggest that you live in a cabin in the woods without neighbors. The Morrises were sternly friendly with my parents, while me and my siblings grew up. They had this son, August, who was in the Scouts with my elderly brother Barry, and he was sort of like a mini version of his father. Bossy, always demanding to be the leader of the activities, and would become quietly red-faced angry if things didn't go his way. Us kids in the neighborhood had a nickname behind his back, and that of a certain Austrian dictator that I don't think you're allowed to say on YouTube, but let's just say that he's someone that you will not see very often. Now anyway, the son isn't the point here. He was sent off to military boarding school at some point during high school, and the wild thing is that he bragged about asking to be sent there. And so we just grew up around the Morrises, who were pretty stern but polite and mostly just sort of kept to themselves. Occasionally they'd complain if our music was too loud or if we had a barbecue that ran past 9 p.m. And if any of mine or my siblings' balls went into the neighbor's garden or over the boundary hedge, well, you could kiss that goodbye. They would return it, but they would puncture it. My dad asked them why they did this once, and they claimed that the balls always hit some sharp object in their garden, and there was nothing they could do about it. What, was their garden made of spiked pits or something? Now, eventually my brother Barry moved out for college, and then a couple of years later so did I, and then a couple of years after that, Andy moved out to go traveling. And that just left my parents and our much, much younger sibling Sammy, who was only 10 when I was 20. Now one day, my mom FaceTimed me in tears telling me that they were being taken to court by the Morrises. And when I got her to calm down and Dad joined the call, they explained that they'd received a legal letter from the neighbors explaining that our boundary hedge had been encroaching on their land for years, and that my family owed them over $400,000 in reparations for lost revenue for use of the land as expansion for an unspecified business. Now, the reason they called me first was because I was studying law at the time. Immediately, this rang a million alarm bells in my head, and I asked them what distance the hedge was supposedly encroaching on the neighbor's land, and they very meekly told me 1 inch. And I asked them to scan the letter and send it over. I did some research, called a few friends, and discovered that, much as I suspected, the law firm representing the Morrises not only was not reputable, but in fact, entirely imaginary. The Morrises had invented their own law firm and sent a fake, threatening letter. And my biggest confusion was why. It was obvious that my parents wouldn't just pay $400,000 without seeking legal counsel. And the answer came a couple of days later when a second letter from the fraudulent law firm arrived. They presented an offer that the bill would be dropped if my parents would agree to shift the boundary hedge 10 feet back, granting a much larger boundary to the neighbors as a sort of cost-free compensation to avoid any monetary demands. Now, this was something that, knowing my parents, if they didn't have a daughter who was a lawyer in training, they may have agreed to that just for a quiet life. Now, I worked it out using some land blueprints and contacted the relevant offices and discovered that the Morrises had applied for an extension to their house and purchased a prefab guest house, but both projects would require them to encroach into my parents' land. And so at the time, I happened to be dating an older guy, who's now my husband, who worked for a law firm specializing in this kind of thing. And he did some digging and checked out some old records, and it turned out that the boundary hedge was in fact around a foot into my parents' property, meaning if anything, the Morrises had been encroaching on our land this entire time. My boyfriend drafted an actual legitimate legal document stating this with the relevant proof, and the letter ended with a confirmation that my family was simply letting things be as long as the Morrises did the same to avoid any kind of escalation. We hoped that being caught red-handed would cause these fools to drop their lies. Clearly, we underestimated just how badly they wanted their extension, or how much money they dropped on this back garden prefab, presumably non-refundable. However, their next move didn't take the form of fake lawyers or legal threats at all. Instead, my parents started receiving notes written like ransom letters, with the letters cut out of various magazines. I'm not joking. They made strange, bizarre threats, such as a promise to kill our pet miniature donkey, something we never even owned, and another letter threatened to poison the koi in our pond. We don't have a pond or koi. The letters were so ridiculous that my parents kept copies, but didn't report them to the police, not at first. But then they became threatening. My parents wouldn't show me the notes directly, but they let slip that the notes names myself and my brothers, and then finally, a note arrived promising that Sammy would never arrive home from school one day when they least expected it, which is when they finally went to the cops. And of course, the cops couldn't prove that the notes came from the Morrises. This harassment went on for 5 years. Acts of petty vandalism, weird pieces of graffiti on the walls of the house, hoses were clipped in the middle of the night with the faucet running so the yard flooded, dead birds and roadkill being left on the doorstep. And the Morrises, these clever idiots, obviously made themselves the victims of their own harassment too, so suspicion didn't fall on them. And then the fires started. Just small, contained fires in the backyard that scorched the lawn. Another classic was that the Morrises would play classical music at full volume at 3:33 a.m. in the morning every single Wednesday. And when it was time for Sammy's exams, they escalated it to every day. My parents filed noise complaints, but the Morrises denied any involvement and, in fact, claimed that they hated classical music. And when investigators were there, somehow they mysteriously managed to know and the music didn't play on those nights. My eldest brother moved home and, in no uncertain terms, threatened the Morrises. The C words had the gall to call the cops on him, and this further undermined our claims against them. They went so far as to try and suggest that my brother was the one committing the vandalism, despite the fact that he'd been living in a totally different state during most of the incidents and had an alibi for most of it. Now, Sammy, meanwhile, was becoming an absolute wreck, and we all felt so hopeless, and it felt like the whole world was against us. In the end, the entire family got together for a family meeting, and we very tearfully decided that the only recourse that we had was to move out of our family home that had been in the family since my mom's childhood. So that's what we did. We put the house up for sale, my parents accepted the first offer they received, and they moved into a smaller house that, realistically, was more manageable for them, especially once Sammy went away to college. There's no happy ending here, really, at least not for us. The lesson is simply that sometimes it's better to walk away than let your entire life be taken up with fighting the fight, even if it is a just and good one. There is an ending, though, but I can't say it's a good one, and as much as I hated the Morrises for what they put us through, I wouldn't wish this on anyone. Remember their son, who willingly went to military school and we nicknamed that Austrian painter? Well, it turns out that Augie had been thrown out of military school, then dishonorably discharged from the military, all without his parents' knowledge. He'd fallen into drugs and violence, and one day, he came home. Augie held his parents at gunpoint with a sawed-off shotgun, zip-tied them back-to-back to dining chairs, and then he and a couple of associates robbed the Morrises of every valuable they could get their hands on. And then, as a parting gift, with the butt of that sawed-off, he shattered both of his father's kneecaps. Nobody knows what caused Augie to hate his parents so much. It's probably not hard to guess, but when he was caught, he kept quiet. And he was caught a few days later as he admitted to what he'd done, but not why he'd done it. He was sent to prison for quite a few years, and Mrs. Morris died shortly after, poetically said to have died of a broken heart. Mr. Morris spent the rest of his years in a hospice, unable to walk, and also never uttered a single word again since that night. And so the new neighbors who bought our family home never had to deal with the neighbors from hell. And the whole story is a reminder of just how completely messed up and pointless the motivations of some people can be, how they can live with themselves when they all cause so much pain, and how when you cause pain to others, sometimes it returns to you tenfold. I don't know if I believe in karma, but in this case, I can't help but feel that no matter how much the Morrises screwed with my family, they got far more than they deserved, and I can only hope their son Augie can one day find some peace. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Don't forget to hit that follow button to be alerted of our weekly episodes every Tuesday at 1 p.m. EST. And if you haven't already, check out Let's Read on YouTube, where you can catch all my new video releases every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. EST. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you in the next episode.